notebook. There's more.
Welcome to episode 6 of CN Live. I'm Joe Lauria, editor-in-chief of Consortium News.
And I'm Elizabeth Voss.
On this week's program, we continue our discussion of the recent revelations of an Australian journalist who was an eyewitness to the publication of the Afghan war logs, and who says the New York Times was setting Julian Assange up to take the rap for publishing the classified material. Mark Davis also said it was Assange who was concerned about redacting names of informants from the files, and not the journalists at the Times and the Guardian, the WikiLeaks partners, and that Assange himself redacted 10,000 names just before publication. We will be showing a speech by Davis's colleague, Mary Kostakidis, and we will replay Mark Davis's talk as well.
And then we will delve again into the ever-widening scandal surrounding the death in prison of pedophile millionaire Jeffery Epstein with journalist Whitney Webb, who has published a multi-part series on Epstein and the world he inhabited. But first, of course, to the headlines. President
Trump provoked outrage even amongst members of his own party when he urged Israeli officials to deny entry to the West Bank to 2 Muslim congresswomen. On Thursday, Trump tweeted, "It would show great weakness if Israel allowed Representative Omar and Representative Tlaib to visit. They hate Israel and all Jewish people, and there's nothing that can be said or done to change their minds. Minnesota and Michigan will have a hard time putting them back in office. They are a disgrace." Just a few hours later, Israel's deputy foreign minister told an Israeli radio station, "The decision has been made. The decision is not to allow them to enter." As the crisis in Kashmir continues to heat up with serious clashes between the Indian and Pakistani military, WikiLeaks highlighted how 9 years ago it published a leaked diplomatic cable that revealed that Indian politician Rahul Gandhi told the US ambassador that extremist Hindu groups could be a bigger threat to India than Pakistan-based Islamist extremists. The case of Jeffery Epstein, the multimillionaire pedophile who died this week in his New York City jail, grows more curious by the day. A leaked coroner's report says that Epstein had 2 broken bones in his throat, and that is more indicative of strangulation than of hanging. Plenty of powerful people did not want facts to emerge at his trial that could implicate them. We will speak later in the program with journalist Whitney Webb, who has been digging deep into the story. But we turn our attention now to a talk given by Mary Kostakidis, a former news presenter at the Australian network SBS, in which she blasts the media for its coverage of Julian Assange. We will also replay an audio-enhanced version of a video we showed last week of Australian journalist Mark Davis, who was an eyewitness to what happened when Assange tried to partner with The Guardian, The New York Times, and Der Spiegel to publish the Afghan war logs. We'll be joined afterwards by George Samueli to discuss Kostakidis' remarks.
A couple of nights ago, I watched Collateral Murder and listened to Ethan McCord speaking about his role in that incident. He found the badly injured children in the van, and the little girl had a stomach wound and her face was covered in glass, and he tried to pick the glass out of her eyes. McCord said killing unarmed civilians daily, often including children, that's just what happened. And there were far worse incidents. Like most service personnel, he came from a poor background, and he went to war to defend America and American values, and instead found they were committing crimes against humanity. He came home severely traumatised. This is what the 2010 WikiLeaks releases revealed, the truth about the horrendous civilian casualties in that war. It was Collateral Murder that first captured the world's attention and is the most potent reminder of why Julian Assange is in Belmarsh today, why he sought refuge in the Ecuadorian embassy, why he was stripped of asylum and dragged from the embassy, and why the US is seeking his extradition on charges that attract a sentence of 175 years that will see him die in prison. This indictment doesn't cover any of the publications after 2010. Julian Assange was a young, courageous, clever, idealistic Australian who believed that those in power should be held to account. He understood that democracy requires the empowerment of people, and that information and truth were central to that, and he understood the potential of digital technology to facilitate this, and developed an ingenious way for whistleblowers to upload material anonymously. Well, not since the Pentagon Papers had there been such shocking revelations, but this new threat to government control of the narrative was greater because it was open-ended. The potential was therefore inestimable ongoing damage to that narrative by those compelled to blow the whistle on lies and injustice. WikiLeaks heralded a new era of increased transparency, harnessing the internet's capacity to strengthen our democracy. In 2010, WikiLeaks followed collateral murder with the Afghan and Iraq war logs and the diplomatic cables. The latter, the cables, showing how US strategic objectives facilitate the creation of a global economic order that enables US corporations to do as they wish. There's an excellent new book about the significance of the cables by Clinton Fernandez, Professor of International and Political Studies, which examines the significance of the cable. So Afghanistan, North Korea, Iraq, you name it, including background on the crisis to Iran and China today, as well as treaties, the purpose of them, who benefits and how, and what the big ticket items are. Intellectual property rights sounds really innocuous, but actually it's often about who gets to live and die, who gets to live a healthy life because of access to generic drugs. In 2016, WikiLeaks published the DNC emails and revealed that the DNC manipulated American democracy by cheating Bernie Sanders of his rightful nomination. This was followed by Vault 7, the CIA's digital bag of tricks, including half a dozen scripts, including Cyrillic script, that allow it to hack into devices and servers with a fake foreign identity. It is indeed what they feared, a tsunami of revelations, which was endless, about almost every government in the world, most of all about the United States actions and motivations and the truth behind their public narrative, thanks to a courageous whistleblower, Chelsea Manning. The documents initially couldn't be ignored. They provided material for countless stories, countless organisations around the world, about war crimes and the wrongdoing of governments and multinational corporations. WikiLeaks and Julian personally received scores of journalism awards and human rights awards. Now, the Australian journalist, editor and publisher faces political prosecution and the prospect of dying in a US prison, with no support from his government, from most journalists, certainly in this country, or publishers in Australia, or the Australian public. And this despite the enormous overreach of the prosecution under a domestic espionage law. He's been indicted and they wish to extradite him. He's a non-US citizen for alleged crimes committed outside the United States, and therefore the dire repercussions are there for press freedom worldwide. If successful, any journalist anywhere who publishes American secrets can be arrested, extradited, tried and imprisoned in the United States. The most frequent question I'm asked is, why is there so little support from the government, from journalists and from the public? And I'd like to start with the easiest one to answer, the government, which has abrogated its responsibility. Yet in the past it's intervened to secure the release of Peter Greste, of James Ricketson, who's with us here tonight, and Peter Wallace and Steve Pratt. However, none of those people were wanted by the US government. James is a palpably decent human being. He's urging us to recognise Julian's political prosecution and urging the government to protect him. Incredibly, and in an unbelievable lack of generosity, having been rescued himself, Peter Greste has firmly and sanctimoniously shut the door behind him, quibbling over whether Julian is a real journalist or a responsible one. Care Australia workers Pratt and Wallace were convicted in 1999 by a Belgrade court of espionage. Both had military backgrounds, both they were tracking military movements in a conflict zone, and as head of Care Australia, Malcolm Fraser, was to discover, to his horror, were also on the payroll of a NATO country, thereby placing at risk all aid operations everywhere, all aid workers under suspicion everywhere, and particularly in the area where they worked, a country that desperately needed assistance. The Australian government did everything in its power to get them out of jail and ensured that SBS did not run the story until they were out of jail. All these cases were resolved through political intervention. I was told by a Labor elder that even if Julian was here at home, no Australian government of any persuasion would refuse to send him to the United States. We have a treaty with the United States, as does the UK, and protests, well, so be it. They'll achieve nothing. All extradition treaties have out clauses, of course, but our government has a real problem standing up to the United States. Another reason for the government's lack of support is that recapturing control of the official narrative suits all governments, really. The US led a new charge against whistleblowers under Obama, and now there's an attempt to criminalise publication. The Australian government followed fast on the heels of Julian's indictment and extradition requests, with raids on the ABC and on another journalist. Recent whistleblower prosecutions include Richard Boyle, Peter Cade, his lawyer David Coterie, David McBride, who is also being prosecuted for revealing what they were getting up to in Afghanistan. It's impossible to stop new people coming forward. It seems that some people's moral compass is such that they'll speak up despite personal repercussions. So our government similarly is trying to rein in the fourth estate, aiming to intimidate future whistleblowers, journalists and publishers. Thirdly, governments only do things they'd rather not do when placed under enormous public pressure, and that pressure simply isn't there. And I'll look at why in a moment. Following the instant protests from journalists and publishers around Australia over the two Australian Federal Police raids, a third was called off and an inquiry into press freedom was announced. So, pressure works a treat. Incredibly, despite the fact that there's an Australian publisher in a high-security prison for journalistic activity in the UK, there was no mention of Julian in any of these protests around the country. There was no mention of Julian in any public discourse about press freedom, including at the National Press Club, where 3 senior Australian journalists spoke. Why aren't journalists supportive? Well, one reason is the notion that Julian isn't a real journalist. He's just a ratbag and somehow deserves what's happened to him. Another is that there's a default position. We tend to follow the leader in journalism, and there's safety in numbers. On the whole, the mainstream media sing from the same songbook, and that's evident in the selection of stories, the angle that the stories take. And at the end of the day, we check that our program's pretty much similar to what everyone else is doing. Pat ourselves on the back and clock off. Affirmation couldn't possibly have gotten anything wrong because everyone's running the same thing. So the guiding principle is sameness. And there's a shared and simple perspective of the world. There's the axis of evil, and all those countries belonging in the axis of evil, their actions and motivations are evil, and our allies, of course, our actions and motivations are implicitly, inherently good. Julian has dared to do something that no one else would. The volume and nature of the revelations were impossible to ignore. He became a public figure, a global public figure, and WikiLeaks continued to reveal how power is in fact exercised and in whose service. But following the period of the war revelations, the mainstream media reset coverage back to normal, back to the songbook, buying the story that he's a narcissist, possibly a racist, finally able to ignore the revelations, dismissing Julian as a tool of the Russians, who interfered in the US election. The traditional media have enjoyed the privilege of being gatekeepers of information, and evident in the Guardian editor Rusbridge's reference to Assange's narcissism, that Julian dared to think he was going to share control in their partnership over what happens to the material. Rusbridge, of course, oblivious to his own arrogance, an enormous arrogance, which is not uncommon around who controls information, who decides what the public know and see. We're often spared, we members of the public, I've got that hat on now, the visceral reality of what's happening, because someone decides it's not really palatable while we're having dinner. The only problem is that the same footage is used in the late evening bulletins. So I don't know who made that excuse up, but it's still being used. But the digital technology has revolutionised our access to information and democratised journalism. These days, any member of the public can capture an atrocity and put it up on the internet, and they do daily. There's been a massive change in the environment mainstream media operates in, causing some discomfort because there's no longer a monopoly on the filtering of information. The specific accusation that some releases have caused harm, I'll deal with in a moment, but the contempt for Julian and the criticism of not being a journalist just because he doesn't have a degree in journalism, as I don't, and as others who produce the work of journalists don't, is a very convenient way to isolate him. Julian has a more sophisticated understanding of geopolitics than most of his detractors put together. He appreciates the nuances and complexity of geopolitics more than most of the journalists that I've worked with. Furthermore, he exposes the important questions that they're not asking and their failure to hold power to account. WikiLeaks not only publishes material in the utmost public interest, its editor doesn't have a paternalistic attitude towards the public. Working in a TV newsroom is where you see contempt for the public, or the punters, as they're referred to. We decide what you need to know and interpret it for you because only we have been trained to do so. Actually, when I was presenting World News, I was well aware that among our audience were people who knew a lot more about the topic than we did, and they were either laughing hysterically or wanted to throw a brick through the TV. Unfortunately, the media have also been very cleverly used in Julian's persecution, used to discredit him, and this has been very important because it's ensured that he doesn't have public support. The media have been used to constantly reinforce three messages with insidious impact. First, he's a narcissist trying to avoid rape charges. Secondly, people have died as a result of his 2010 releases. Third, that he was used by Russia and responsible for Trump's election. And I'd like to quickly address each of those things. Julian has never been charged with rape. The definition of rape in Swedish law is such that it need not necessarily involve any aggression or even any coercion. The women had no intention of reporting him for anything. They went to the police because one of them wanted to find out if he could be forced to have an HIV test. This woman, who initiated the police visit, in fact refused to sign the statement the police prepared for her and was distressed that this had become the outcome of this visit. There's a book of transcripts of the police interrogations, remarkably in Sweden, very easy to obtain under FOI, and they were published in a book in 2013. Julian has wanted to clear his name and has never refused to go to Sweden. All he's wanted is a guarantee that they would not extradite him to the United States. And we have to remember that Sweden has been involved with the CIA in renditions. So he had very good reason to be asking for this guarantee, which was refused. He offered to be interviewed then for years in London before it was finally accepted, but he still hasn't been charged because there's no evidence to warrant it. The case has been closed and reopened umpteen times by umpteen prosecutors. Julian sought refuge in the embassy for fear of political prosecution in the United States. 7 years later, Ecuador and the United Kingdom broke international law, stripped him of asylum and dragged him from the embassy. And the US immediately served the UK with an extradition request. And lest we're tempted to think, oh my goodness, this is what it's always been about. He was right. Up pops reliable Sweden again to remind everyone he's still a wanted man there, knowing that he may never have the opportunity to clear his name and knowing that they don't have a basis on which to charge him. Anne Ramberg, until recently, the head of the Swedish Bar Association, put a very courageous statement up on their website, which I think now has been removed. I can't find it, and she's no longer the head of the association, but she said that Sweden and the UK had behaved appallingly in this matter, that Swedish prosecutors were basically bringing the Swedish justice system into disrepute, and that Assange was being persecuted for exposing war crimes and had performed an enormous service to the public. Regarding the question of harm, 60 Minutes recently trotted out Jim Moland, who again was allowed to repeat claims that are false. There are 2 internal ADF reports. They're available on the internet. They're quoted extensively in this book by Professor Clinton Fernandez. That one of these reports was commissioned by Julia Gillard, and Jim Moland's very well aware of these reports. They concluded that no one was harmed. No Australian soldier, no Afghan or Iraqi collaborator. The only thing that the documents that were published did was embarrass the government. Though it was established at Bradley Manning's military hearing that no one was harmed, no American either, was harmed as a result of the publications, the former Assistant Secretary of State claimed on Four Corners recently that people died. And despite that there have been no reports to substantiate this at all, he wasn't challenged. This very serious claim was allowed to stand without substantiation. And while we're on Four Corners, they also used a grab at former Prime Minister Gillard, making her false claim that what Julian had done was illegal. Very soon after, the head of the Australian Federal Police corrected her, saying that Julian had broken no law. Another error they made was to say he was wanted for sex crimes. No, it has not been established that any crime was committed. On the other hand, the UN rapporteur for torture, who said, in 20 years of my work with victims of war, violence and political persecution, I've never seen a group of democratic states ganging up to deliberately isolate, demonise and abuse a single individual for such a long time and with so little regard for human dignity and the rule of law. No mention of this on Four Corners, nor of Bill Mills's warning against sending Julian to the United States, where he says he would not receive a fair trial, he'd be tortured and he'd die in a US prison. Instead, Four Corners trotted out Hillary Clinton and peddled the Russiagate line, which I'll deal with in a second. For an investigative program, Four Corners repeated a series of false or unsubstantiated statements and revealed nothing new. The story, hero or villain, channeled the lowbrow and fueled prejudice. The tone was set and reinforced with the repetition of a cheap, transparent and ridiculous device, the facial morphing sequence, to remind us that this chameleon is untrustworthy, in case the repeated use of the word narcissist wasn't doing the job. You'd be forgiven for thinking that none of the rest of us cut our hair, grow a beard or grow old. Older, because he's not old. The final sentence in the story attributes blame to his activism for any clampdown on journalism that may ensue worldwide. So, the Four Corners verdict is pretty transparent. He's a villain. In my view, Australia's premier investigative program discredited itself by doing harm to its subject, a man whose life is already in danger, in contravention of the ABC's code of practice. The program's executive producer does nothing to dispel accusations of bias with her unprofessional tweets, and you can only afford to express such contempt openly when you're assured there'll be no repercussions. On being a tool of Russia, collaborating with Russia and publishing the DNC emails, manipulating the US election. WikiLeaks published material showing it was in fact the DNC who manipulated the election, but that message has been lost, overshadowed by the false accusations repeatedly trumpeted through the media and repeated on Four Corners. Extraordinary, despite the time allocated to Russiagate on Four Corners, no mention in the program of what was actually in the DNC emails. Julian would have indeed been manipulating the election if he'd withheld publication of that material. Would the same accusation have been made if the material was about Trump? And I think we all know the answer to that. There has never been any evidence that Julian colluded with the Russians. You wouldn't know about it, but last week, the whole Russian collusion story was demolished in a United States court. No collusion, Trump, no collusion, Assange, no collusion, Papadopoulos, no collusion, and a series of others. Never mind Mueller's wishy-washy report. Not only did the Clinton-appointed judge throw the DNC collusion case out, he said that the WikiLeaks publications were in the utmost public interest and deserved the strongest First Amendment protection. This is huge news. Has it been reported anywhere in the mainstream media? By the way, hip hip hooray for the First Amendment, which protects journalistic activity, quote, it doesn't seek to define who is or who isn't a journalist, acknowledging that it's all about the right to publish the truth. Finally, on the accusation that these documents came from the Russians, and here is where our premier investigative current affairs program might have revealed something to the public, ignored so far by the mainstream media. Four Corners could have interviewed William Binney, the former technical director of the NSA, who's largely responsible for developing NSA capability and understands it better than most. Binney says the emails could not possibly have been obtained via a hack. It was a download onto a storage device. This occurred on the east coast of America, and this is a fabrication. He provides a number of reasons for this and proof. This information is available on independent investigative journalism websites. We await the findings now of the investigation by the US Attorney General into how President Trump says the Russiagate conspiracy was manufactured. Media bias is the biggest hurdle to the defence of Julian's human rights. He's fair game because he's been disowned by journalists and he's in turn disowned by the public. In failing Julian, the press is failing itself. Certainly in Australia, there's little awareness of the repercussions for press freedom should his conviction be successful. And to this matter, Four Corners devoted exactly 4.5 minutes at the end of a 1 3/4 hour program. I travelled to London twice to see Julian. First time with Professor Stuart Rees, who suggested that we present him with the Sydney Peace Foundation Medal. So off we went in 2011. and presented him a medal for his exceptional courage in pursuit of human rights. It was at the Frontline Club, and at the time, if I recall correctly, he only had a few hours during the day when he was free to move around. In 2013, concerned about his predicament, I travelled to London and spent 3 days with him and his team in the Ecuadorian embassy, where this small, smart, capable, dedicated team were developing a sophisticated portal for the public to access the vast trove of documents with commentary that contextualised the information and cross-referencing. I sat in on meetings with Julian, with people from around the world, and so many people who don't know Julian have an opinion about him, his personality and his motivations. Julian is he's an individual that's completely absorbed by an enormous undertaking. He's trying to redress the imbalance in power between citizens and the state. I observed him to be completely oblivious to the effect he has on young women. All to matters irrelevant in his head. The rape allegations are disgracefully being used to discredit him, and it's frankly an insult to victims of rape. Julian is being destroyed for revealing war crimes, and we need to stand up for his human rights and against his political persecution.
You're watching CN Live on Consortium News. I'm Joe Lauria.
And I'm Elizabeth Voss. Join us every Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern.
We're streaming through consortiumnews.com.
And on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and DLive.
CN Live.
Your weekly insight into the news.
Everyone has an opinion on Julian Assange. I certainly do. But I don't know that it's worth me offering opinions tonight. After the Four Corners piece in particular, I felt that I could offer observations rather than opinion, or rather eyewitness observations that I had that I haven't revealed before. And essentially it gravitates around a couple of enduring slurs against Julian, that he's cavalier to the lives of people that were in his documents, and that he had a different level of professionalism than the true journalists did, that is, the Guardian journalists and the New York Times journalists, in 2010 when he first came to prominence. Well, I was there. I was there when he met them. I was there when they formed the bunker at the Guardian, where they all gathered. The Spiegel, the Guardian, New York Times, and Julian. I'd been travelling with him, a very hard man to find. I found him and stuck to him like glue. And so when he went to the bunker, I was with him. And the reason they let me into the bunker was that he was an incredibly unreliable and unorthodox man. So this is pretty much it. This is Life Possessions, right? This is you.
This is not me. This is portable me.
His idea of starting work was midnight. Their idea was starting at 9 a.m. and going home at 5. And the job I did, which allowed the Guardian to let me into their fortress, was that I would go and find Julian. They thought I was part of WikiLeaks, I think. I would find Julian and I'd bring him to the Guardian at a reasonable compromise, maybe 2 in the afternoon. So they let me in. I was there every moment. Every moment that Julian was there, I was there. And every moment that those journalists have since re-narrated in their books, in their articles, in their Four Corners appearances, about the enormous integrity that they had and the lack of integrity that Julian had, I can say is a complete lie. And I am the witness to it. So I'd like to just play a couple of very small clips. I won't bore you with long clips, but it will just help you visualise the people that I'm talking about and the places I'm talking about. So this is a story I did in 2010 in the lead up to the Afghan Royals, which was the first large release. And Julian was an unknown figure at this point and about to become incredibly well known.
He's not flying entirely solo. For the first time in WikiLeaks history, he has pulled in some mainstream media heavyweights to collaborate in preparing material.
So where are we heading now? Off to the bunker in The Guardian.
And what's in the bunker? What's happening in the bunker?
In the bunker we have our team from Guardian, us, the Spiegel and New York Times.
So this is the bunker we're about to go. You often hear about it. They all refer to it when they're doing interviews.
Filled with computers, but at least it doesn't.
And it was here that they were taking what Julian had, which was impenetrable data.
Their way through the material.
They describe what they're doing during this 3-hour slaughter. Okay, and then there's like another 5 killed here and there, and 3 here. So now look at the exactly.
Just so you know, that's Nick Davies. That was Julian's main contact at The Guardian. Davies has made the most recurring and repetitive statement that Julian had this cavalier attitude to life. That's what I say is a lie. I was there. If there was any cavalier attitude going on from my observations, it was The Guardian journalists. The Guardian journalists had this disdain for the impact of that material. The Guardian journalists, at best, had a type of gallows humour as to what would happen to anyone revealed in these documents. And I can tell you, he often narrates, if you've read the books, he narrates a dinner that they went to where Julian said, well, if they die, they die. Now that is the only event that I wasn't at. I remember the dinner, I didn't go to the dinner. But I can contradict every other account they talk about from that room where anyone expressed any concern whatsoever about the lives of people except for Julian Assange. Except for Julian Assange. Now that has been such a stark contrast to what's been repeated that I just wanted to spend this time tonight dissecting that a little bit. I haven't done it before because it wasn't particularly relevant. Julian's been in custody on sexual assault charges. Now he's in custody on these the espionage material relating to the documents that these guys are working on together. So now it's highly relevant, and I do want to put it on the public record.
So it's suspicious. The other thing
For anyone to pull these 3 important organisations together, yeah, 3 competitors together, and us.
At some stage, they bring in this AC-130 gunship.
Up in the corner, David Lee. David Lee wrote the most damning book about Julian. These guys, you might pick up on it, they were all over Julian, right? Julian had something valuable to them. They were fawning over Julian. None of this, well, yes, we're the professionals and we retained our distance. There was no distance, I can promise you, between them and Julian at this point. David Lee's also, ironically or tragically, the bloke that printed the password to the original files. So when he did his book, in a moment of boasting, in his book he put the password that opened the original files, all of them, that had been redacted, actually. The Julian had physically redacted. This clown put the password up, printed it, and it was still active. It still worked. It still worked. That's what brought the full cache of documents to the public eye, was him. So what they were doing in this room were taking the raw data, which I saw. You could see it on a computer, but it was very difficult to read, to filter, to understand. A bit like reading an XLL sheet or something like that, like an accounting spreadsheet. The people that brought that material to life, gave birth to it, was the Guardian. WikiLeaks did none of that work. Julian didn't have the capacity to do the work. It was here with Guardian staff, those two journalists, I think 2, maybe 3 computer experts. They created the WikiLeaks database themselves. If Julian's in jail, they should be in jail. I mean, quite literally, they should be in jail. They created this, they put it up, they put it out to the world. So what they were doing were generating individual reference codes for every entry in the WikiLeaks material. They gave it a graphical interface, a look, and they made it searchable. That was the Guardian, or entirely the Guardian. Also in the room,
they're good. I mean, everyone has been generous and flexible.
It's the Spiegel.
You always want to sort by civilian casualties. Sort is
Are we still only on one? Sorry, I'm getting carried away.
And these are the techos coming in. So it's about a week of technical work. I mean, $100,000 probably to do the type of work they did. And the New York Times were coming in the week that I was there, were coming in regularly on the telephone. Between them, between these 3 groups, the Spiegel, Guardian, New York Times, they were fossicking through the material as the tech guys kind of gave birth to it, fossicking through, looking for stories that would be of interest to them. Of course, it was apparent that you'd be risking, if not the safety, certainly exposing the identity of many people. There's tens of thousands of documents there. I never witnessed a conversation where anyone took that seriously, not once. The only conversation that occurred was between Nick Davies and David Lee. And Julian wasn't there. Julian hadn't arrived yet, but I was there maybe an hour before. And it occurred to Nick Davies, as they pulled up an article that they were in fact going to put in the newspaper. He said, well, we can't name this guy, right? We can't name this guy, obviously, in the newspaper. And then someone said, well, he's going to be named on the website. Davey said some words to the effect, well, we'll really cop it then if we're blamed for putting that name up. And the words I remember very precisely from David Lee was he gazed across the room at Davies and said, but we're not publishing it. So what he's in effect saying, they're going to let Julian be the fall guy. They're going to create this, they're going to make it searchable, they're going to give it a graphic look, they're going to release it, they're then going to share the link to it and put 13 pages of newsprint dedicated to say, go and look at it, and they'll say, well, but we didn't publish it, Julian published it. Now this was highly alarming to me, and I did raise it with Julian, who has, amongst his other qualities, he might be a genius, but he does have a certain naivety about him in reading people, in my view. He thought these guys were great. They were being nice to him. They were all absolutely, this was a collective effort. There's no idea that, he was the source and they were the journalists. If you watch this story, you'll get a better feel of that, right? They were all in it together. And Julian didn't quite believe that they'd be pushing him out onto the plank and then saying, oh, it's not us, we're just reporters, I mean, shameful, embarrassingly shameful. And so there's another scene I'd like to show you along those lines. This is about 4 days before the release of the Afghan warlogs. And remember, Afghan warlogs was really the public announcement of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. He wasn't very known prior to this. This is a conversation that's linked to what I was talking about before, from that comment of David Lee, oh, but we're not publishing it. We can wash our hands of this, right? And how successfully they have done that. But this was a conversation Julian relates to a lecturer at London University who was a very big supporter of Julian's. Gavin McPadden. Yeah, this is Gavin McPadden's house.
As the new material starts to circulate between the 3 publications, the full scope of the data becomes clearer, and one of the partners seems to be getting a little nervous.
So the latest squabble is not over the date, they're all happy with that, but to the precise time. So anyway, the Times has come back and said they don't want to go first.
Why?
They want us to scoop them.
Seriously? Oh, so they can claim they were reprinting somebody else's news.
So, that's right.
Yeah, exactly.
So they can claim that we didn't.
We just
weren't
were reporting
involved,
what was already there.
We were just reporting on what someone else did.
That's good. So who's going first?
The New York Times. I mean, wants a web startup press to scoop them. Wants to be scooped.
I mean, that's chilling to watch that now. Julian's in jail because of that subterfuge. Clearly discussed amongst themselves and not discussed with Julian. You can see his shock. What are you talking about? We're doing this together. This is a collective effort. What are you talking about? You want me to put it? You don't want to get it? I thought you'd be busting to get it, you know? And you can just see the way the honesty in which he narrates that story. That's why he's in prison today. That's why they're not in prison, why they should be. So, I had a discussion with Julian around these issues, and he went back into them to revisit the issue of identifying people within the warlogs. It was Julian Assange who brought that issue to the fore, not The Guardian, not the New York Times, because they didn't care, because there was no reflection upon them. They actually didn't care what happened to the people, they couldn't give it stuff, right? But as long as there was no blowback on them, they were relaxed about it. It was Julian that brought it to a head. The release was to be on Monday morning. It was Thursday or Friday, I think it was Friday, where Julian said, well, we need to pull these names out. The names that are identified as informers. If it's going to endanger them, we need to pull them out. Now that called their bluff. Well, not that he was bluffing, but that absolutely threw them into a panic. It meant they wouldn't get their publication date. He asked for it to be delayed because they weren't going to assist in this task. He said, well, I'll do it with my people, but we need time. Now, because they were, as well as being allies, Guardian, New York Times, Der Spiegel, they were also competitors, bitter competitors, very unusual to be in the same room for them, and they didn't trust each other. So they couldn't agree that they thought there was a trick going on. They all got ready to print on Monday. No, we're going on Monday. So what happens, all these people that now write books about how concerned they were, they all went home on Friday afternoon, back to Essex, back to Surrey, whatever. And Julian was left with not just the task, but the moral responsibility of trying to cleanse those documents in some way, and he did. All night. When I say all night, I mean from 5 p.m. till 9 a.m. the next day. We were sharing an apartment at the time. Julian removed 10,000 names by himself, not with the support team of The Guardian, etc., etc., etc. By himself, he removed them. Then it came to Sunday night. There's no particular scene to show you here, but I'm just showing to give you the flavour. This is the Frontline Club. Sunday night. The press conference is Monday morning. All the press editions are being printed and ready to be released. Now, this was my favourite moment, actually. So,
the information is now on the internet. 200,000 pages, mostly classified secret. It's the raw details of America's war in Afghanistan.
It will be the beginning of a media storm that will last for days.
Now, what really happened? They built this artifice that Julian was the man to walk the plank for them, and they'll report about a man falling off a plank. Right? That was the premise. But WikiLeaks never released it that night. So WikiLeaks were meant to release on Sunday night. The Monday papers would report this event. He couldn't get it live. So all of this evening, it was expected to be up at about 9 p.m. It was meant to be live. It couldn't go up. And the panicked calls from the New York Times started coming in, like hysterical calls. I could hear them, everyone could hear them. They're holding the presses, hold the front page. Because it was saying this, weird group WikiLeaks had released, had published, had put online, trying to report a news event. It didn't go up. And their phone calls became more hysterical through the evening up until, I forget now the time difference, if it's important I'll try and become as precise as I can, up until about 2 a.m. they held the presses in New York and then just had to go. Now, and then the storm unfolded, and you'll see and hear a bit of it there, the storm unfolded. But they were essentially printing a lie. WikiLeaks didn't publish that night, and in fact didn't publish the next day. I think it was about 2 days. I don't know if they were known, but I think it was about 2 days before it got up. So these high priests of journalistic ethics were all of them very happily colluding in publishing a lie, that they were reporting something that in fact didn't happen, and they knew it hadn't happened, and they'd set Julian up from the start. I think it's important. I think that distinction is important when you see this recurring slur, this slander against Julian that started in 2010. He's cavalier with people's lives and he has no ethics. Started in 2010. I would have well and truly thought it would have washed away by now, but to see it on four corners again, 9 years later, in great detail, I feel compelled at least to address those issues. So I won't take any more time. I'm grateful to have done that. Thank you.
Okay, we're back now with my co-host Elizabeth Voss in Fayetteville, Arkansas, and George Samueli is joining us from Budapest, Hungary.
By George!
George, welcome to CN Live. We've just seen the videos of Mary Kostakidis and Mark Davis. Mary Kostakidis was a well-known news presenter in Australia on the SBS network. That's sort of their world service. They deal with world news. It's a very serious station, as much more serious, I think, than ABC. And she laid out for us really the whole Assange story, particularly attacking her colleagues in the media, first saying that they would not consider Assange a journalist, and then she hits on the really important one about the herd mentality in journalism, that there's safety in numbers. She says that if everybody else has the story right, then they must be right. And in fact, I've had that experience many times in working in this profession, that everybody can get it wrong, and then it doesn't matter because everybody said the same thing. And then she makes this third point, George, that I want to ask you about all of them really, but this one in particular I find interesting, that Assange's revelations proved to be impossible for them to ignore. When he came forward and partnered with the media, the New York Times, the Spiegel, and the Guardian, as we'll talk about in the Mark Davis video, they had to make a decision here. if they really want to keep up the pretense that they are defending the public's interest, and that's what journalism is all about, I think they often pretend that because this is too much evidence that they're actually defending powerful interests, not the public's. They could not ignore these stories because it would be too obvious then. Assange could have made it known that he brought it to them and they didn't want it. So they had to deal with this. Now, we learned from Davis how they dealt with it. But first, let's talk about these 3 points about journalism that Mary made. What was your impression, George?
Well, it was a very good summary, and she was absolutely right. How the journalists were very eager to embrace every single smear of Julian Assange, and she went through all of them. The smear of that he was working for the Kremlin, when no evidence has ever been presented that he had anything to do with the Kremlin. And the media knew perfectly well in 2010, when they were cooperating with the material that they were publishing with the Afghan war logs, and the Iraqi war diary, and of course Cablegate. They knew perfectly well that Julian Assange was not working for the Kremlin. Later on, they pretended to believe that he was somehow with the Russians. So there was that. And then the whole story of these rape allegations. Again, the journalist pretended to take seriously a case that was obviously bogus. I mean, it was obvious anyone with even, could undertake the minimum amount of research could see that this was a fraudulent case. And yet the media pretended that this was somehow, that something serious was taking place, or a serious investigation was going on, that Julian Assange had actually committed some serious crime. And they reported it in a way to suggest that he had committed a serious crime. So it's one thing that when governments hate Julian Assange, of course they hate Julian Assange. I mean, Julian Assange exposes what they do. Understandable, that's their interest. But the fact that the journalists, like this, this herd-like, savage animals attacked him, that's really troubling. That somehow reflects something about the state of journalism today, that they've made not the slightest effort to defend him, and instead have actually tried to smear him and destroy his reputation. And I think she brought that out very nicely.
One good line was, she said, Julian Assange doesn't have contempt for the public. TV newsrooms do. They determine what the public needs to know or not know, and will give them what the public wants. That's the old trope that you kept hearing, I've heard for so long. We're giving them what the public wants. And their job is to give the public what they need to know about what's happening in the world.
That's it. And I think that's when he himself, I think, grew disillusioned with working with these mainstream journals, the New York Times, the Guardian, Der Spiegel. These are the biggest names in world journalism. And he grew tired of them because he thought that they're not really interested in news. They're not interested in informing the public. They're interested in their own bottom line and in currying favors with the powers that be. And that's why he said, no, I'm not going to work with them anymore. I'm going to be publishing this information. Well, and that's it. Because these people decide, well, we will decide what the public should know. We will decide what should be released. And that's not what they should be doing. The public should be informed. That should be the function of journalism.
That's the bottom line. It gets far worse than that when we hear what Mark Davis had to say in regard to the Guardian, the Spiegel, and the New York Times. Elizabeth, do you want to weigh in?
Yes.
Session of Mary's remarks first.
Definitely. No, and I agree with what you both said, and I think Joe's point about the way in which she's describing the newsroom angle versus what WikiLeaks was trying to do, that really does highlight how important it is that someone of Mary's stature with her history in journalism would be the one to just rip apart the news media this way. I think that's really, really important and valuable that she did that. And I think that, that type of summary from the inside of the contempt that she describes of the news towards the public was really good to hear and really, really informative.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And this show, the show that she was describing, and we've already heard a lot about it. I mean, this was completely a disgraceful performance. And so the idea that, well, we're going to look at it both sides of it, the case, you know, we're hero or villain, you know, it's all really just to show that he's a villain. So it was just a gigantic smear job at a time when, you know, for all we know, I mean, he's seriously ill, and at the very least, he's fighting for his life.
Right. That program, of course, was the Four Corners two-part documentary that aired a couple of weeks ago that, as you say, George, tried to look like they were balanced. They talked to Kristen Kraftenson, the editor-in-chief of WikiLeaks. Who knows what was left on the cutting room floor about what he said. You know, he got a few things in there. And in the end, actually, that program, they kind of made it seem like that he wasn't such a bad guy after all. It was a very strange ending. And that might have something to do with the fact of the Espionage Act indictment, because that puts all journalists in the crosshairs. But let's move on to Mark Davis, because this is really extraordinarily significant. We talked a little bit about it last week. We've gotten a better listen to it. Essentially, what Davis is saying here is that, and I have an issue with what he's saying, but that the New York Times and the Guardian, had no concern about the lives of the informants that would be named in the Afghan war logs release. And that is a major or important feature of the indictment under the Espionage Act against Assange. It was Assange himself who was concerned about that. And he spent the entire Friday night until 5 a.m. the next morning, 9 a.m. the next morning, from 5 to 9 a.m. to 9 a.m., redacting 10,000 names on his own because they didn't care about that, where they have now portrayed themselves as the ones who did, and Assange didn't care about that. Now Mark Davis, of course, was there inside the bunker, as the Guardian called it, where they worked with Der Spiegel and on the phone with the New York Times for what was apparently in a collective joint effort to publish simultaneously the Afghan war logs. Now, what Davis makes really clear is that Assange and WikiLeaks did not have the technical capacity to create the database, but the Guardian did. So the Guardian created the database. They created a searchable database. They published it eventually online and in the pages of their newspaper. And yet he quotes David Lee, one of the editors there, saying, well, we're not publishing. We're not publishing. But in fact, they did publish. And then the New York Times wanted WikiLeaks to go first, just stunned Assange, because they wanted him to walk the plank, as Davis said. As Mark Davis said, they wanted Assange to be a hole in the bag with this. But my issue is, and I'm going to put it out right now, there's nothing in the Espionage Act about who published first. The issue is who possessed classified information and disseminated it. And the Guardian, the New York Times, Der Spiegel, and WikiLeaks all possessed the classified information and all disseminated it. That is what is at stake, not who first disseminated it or not, who first possessed it. Okay, WikiLeaks first possessed it. So this, and the other issue is the renaming of the informants, even though it's in the indictment, he's not charged with any crime for doing that. Because, first of all, we now know he actually redacted a lot of them, because that's not a crime in the United States. It's a crime to reveal the name of an intelligence agent, a covert agent. It is not a crime to reveal the name of an informant. So it looks like the Guardian and the Times still were worried about holding the bag, and they wanted it to appear that they were just reporters and Assange was their source. George.
That's right. No, that's exactly right. That was the idea behind it, is that, hey, it's Julian Assange. You know, how he got the information, we don't know. We're just simply, we're just a messenger. You know, we're just revealing what it is that he has. And of course, what Davis points out is that they were actually lying about it, because when they ran with that story, WikiLeaks hadn't even published the material. It wasn't available on the WikiLeaks site. The material that the Guardian and the Times were saying was available there. So they were actually lying by saying, well, we're just reporting what's on the WikiLeaks site. But in fact, it wasn't on the WikiLeaks site. And there's a real smarminess to this. And the New York Times does this all the time. I mean, just tangentially, whenever there's a sex scandal, they don't actually report the sex scandal. They report what the National Enquirer is reporting about the sex scandal. That's how they always get around it. I think they did that with the Jennifer Flowers. I think one of the Clinton scandals. They didn't actually directly report the actual sex scandal. They just went, well, this is what the National Enquirer is saying, and we're just reporting what the National Enquirer. I mean, this is this kind of smarmy New York Times tactic. So they did this in this case. But as you say, they're not really fully aware that the Espionage Act would apply to the New York Times as much as it would apply to WikiLeaks. So they just simply may have had bad legal advice. They thought it would only apply to them, but they were safe.
And the critical point there about the fact that the Guardian, the New York Times, Der Spiegel were creating these databases and actually hosting the material themselves, that carries across all the way through all of this secret classified material, not just in the Afghan war diaries or Afghan war logs, but all the way through to Cablegate. I mean, when you look at Cablegate, the Guardian, Der Spiegel, the New York Times, they all also presented that material on their own websites as opposed to WikiLeaks hosting it all. I mean, I'm not that WikiLeaks didn't host the Cablegate material, of course, but I'm saying that the Guardian itself has thousands and thousands and thousands of cables that you can still go search yourself. So the idea that WikiLeaks was the only outlet that was actually giving this material to the public, that is such an important point that Davis makes for the public to understand that that's not how things happened. But obviously the establishment press is not going to give you that idea from their telling of that history.
Right.
As Davis says, quite literally, they, being the Guardian and the New York Times, should be in jail. They created this. He meant the Guardian, actually. They created this, they brought it up, and they put it out to the world. And yet, who's in jail? Assange.
That's right. And in that in New York Times editorial, the one in which they expressed some reservations about that later indictment, the 17-count indictment, they said, well, we weren't actually partners with WikiLeaks. We treated WikiLeaks as a source. So, you know, we didn't really consider him as a journalist. We considered him as a source of information. So leave us alone, you know, do what you have to do to him, but, you know leave us out of it.
And then we hear how the New York Times tried to get WikiLeaks to scoop them. They
Right.
want to go first. And Assange is shown to be naive, this is what Davis says, and not understanding what the hell he was dealing with until that point, because he was not privy to these conversations where Davis was in the room with the journalists without Assange being present, and he relays this conversation where they actually say that we're going to not go first, and that we're only going to act like reporters here. We didn't publish this, when of course they did. And as Davis says, Julian is in jail because of that subterfuge. Clearly, it was discussed amongst themselves, but not with Julian. That's why he's in prison today, and they are not in prison, but should be. And I don't think any of them should be in prison. I mean, technically, on the Espionage Act, they're all guilty of that part of the Espionage Act, which in my opinion should be challenged in court and thrown out because it clearly runs up against the First Amendment, but it is on the books, and they threw the book at Assange and not at any of these other guys who will never be touched. Because why? Because they're basically servants of power. They are not servants of the public as Assange is, and they can control. The intelligence agencies have more or less learned that they can control big newspapers like The Guardian and the New York Times. They cannot control Julian Assange.
Right, and what is so shocking, as from what Davis's presentation, is how much The Guardian has been smearing Julian Assange for all these years. This was 2010. He's been smearing it for almost 10 years now. There was, first of all, that Davis's account at that dinner, which he claimed that Julian Assange said, well, if something happens to them, so much the worse for them, which, as the other Davis is saying, is just not the way Julian Assange thought. That's not his mentality. And not once did he ever hear any of these Guardian journalists express any concern about the safety of sources or anything like that. It was Julian Assange who cared about the safety of sources, not any of the Guardian people. And that's still all of them, the Davis, Russ Bridger, David Lee, Luke Harding, all of them. We've been smearing Julian Assange for years and years, peddling about the Swedish case. and then writing entire books about how he was working for the Kremlin. And keep in mind, the Guardian made a lot of money of Julian Assange. I mean, not just the book that potboiler that they wrote, even though the Guardian had nothing to do with WikiLeaks. And, it was all Julian Assange who had got this information. So the Guardian really just fell into their laps, and yet they managed to write a book about it and made money. And then there was a movie made of it. Not one penny of it ever went to Julian Assange. Not one penny went to Chelsea Manning. Guardian kept all of it. So it really is yeah. And then remember when Luke Harding later on, last year when they ran a story about how Julian Assange was meeting Paul Manafort, complete utter twaddle. This is again the same Luke Harding who had made so much money off Julian Assange.
Luke wrote a book called Collusion, and when
that's it.
Clear and then finally official in the Mueller report, there was no collusion.
Right.
I was out on a limb, and he had to grab something, in my opinion, to try to save his reputation. So he bought that ridiculous Manafort story.
Right. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, Elizabeth. Yes.
I was going to add that the one thing I disagreed with that Davis mentioned in that clip that we watched was when he mentioned that the reason he had not come forward earlier was because Assange was, quote, in custody on sex charges. And we know that that's not true. He was not charged. It was an investigation, and he was not in, quote, in custody. He was in the embassy as a political refugee with asylum. It had nothing to do with sex charges, despite the media presenting it that way. So I disagree with that part of what Davis said. But other than that, an incredible look at that history that no one has ever heard before.
I'd like to think he was he just misspoke about that.
Yeah.
I've done that because it's so much out there that he was charged. It's very easy to say he was charged when there's only been an investigation.
Right.
Charges filed. You mentioned the New York Times editorial. He was the source. We were the reporters. It goes all the way back to Bill Keller's 2011 article in the New York Times Magazine, as Kathy Rogan is pointing out to us, saying that Assange was considered more a source than a partner or a collaborator. Keller says it was Rusbridge who first referred to him as a source, and homeless, quote, as an eccentric former computer hacker of Australian birth and no fixed residence. That's how they saw him. A guy who came in and dropped in their lap a major scoop that they wanted him to own so that they thought they could somehow avoid any problem with the government about publishing these classified materials, even though if their lawyers had to point out to them that it's about possession and dissemination. Who doesn't matter who goes first, but they still, would rather have him taken the rap or go out on the plank, as Davis said. And it turns out, as you point out, George, that the New York Times wound up going first anyway.
Right. yeah, that's right. I guess then they felt, okay, even if the lawyer said, oh, it doesn't matter, if it's the Espionage Act, you're as liable as he is, Bill Keller may well have thought, well, yeah, but the government will still target Julian Assange. They'll still think he's the one who's the worst. He's the culprit. Whereas we're the New York Times, they're not going to go after us because we're the New York Times. I mean, that's they're not going to start messing around with us. So that was probably their calculation. They said, okay, he'll be the fall guy, and they're going to leave us alone. And
they have.
Yeah, that's right.
They have.
That's it. Yeah.
They're not too worried about him being in prison right now.
No.
I'm happy with that. These people are beyond. As Davis said, it was shockingly shameful, or embarrassingly shameful behavior.
And that story, but the one that you're talking about, that Bill Keller story, remember that's where he talked about how scruffy he looked. Remember he was wearing different socks on his feet. He was smelly. He had BO and all that. I mean, it was just.
Not us who shower every day. We don't go to jail.
That's it.
Well, I want to thank you, George, for coming on again to talk about that. This is a story that it needs to get legs, and I'm doing what I can. And we're going to continue to keep our eye on this one and see what else we can come up with. So again, thanks for joining us from Budapest. Okay. And now we'll move on to our next story. And before we get to that next story, I just wanted to mention that Mark Davis might, in fact, become a good defense witness for Assange if he ever should stand trial based on the the claims and the statements he made about what happened in the days leading up to the publication of the Afghan war logs with the Guardian and the New York Times. Now switching to a different topic, which is consuming a lot of the media right now, is of course Jeffrey Epstein, the multi-millionaire pedophile who was in a jail in New York City and was found dead or died later in a hospital a couple of days ago. And we're joined to talk about that with Whitney Webb, who's been all over the web in numerous interviews. I saw her on George Galloway's show and other places, and I'm really happy you joined us from, I guess, you're in Santiago, are you, Chile?
I am actually 10 hours from there, but I generally just say that because most people don't know other cities in Chile. But yeah, I'm in Chile. And
the city you're in Chile. You want to say? Maybe.
I'm closest to Temuco is the name, but most people don't know where that is. That's fine.
Well, thank you for joining us. So, Whitney, you've written this 3-part series in Mint Press News. It's being widely quoted and referred to, and you've got a 4th one coming out that I know Elizabeth is quite keen on talking to you about. The way I see this right now is something unusual in this scandal. There seems to be a feeding frenzy going on in both the Democratic and Republican sides of this story, so that both Fox and the others are interested because the potential targets of a further investigation are Bill Clinton and Donald Trump. So I think both sides would like to see them both brought down. I wonder if you think that we might actually find out something. And by that I mean, will there be a serious investigation by the Department of Justice, or is there a conflict of interest there from Bill Barr, given that his father was the headmaster at the school that hired Epstein to teach math without a degree? He had no degree. And of course, Barr himself was former CIA and his father was OSS. So are we going to look at a serious investigation here going forward?
I'm not expecting a serious investigation, and that's mainly because not just of Bill Barr's connection to Epstein, I guess, through his father, who worked at the Office of Strategic Services, but the fact of Bill Barr's own history. So, for example, when he began work at the CIA, I believe in the 70s, he worked at the Office of Legislative Counsel, and basically what he spent most of his time doing there, beginning in 1975, was stonewalling the Church Committee and efforts to sort of bring, make the CIA accountable for covert operations in the past. And one of the things that he fought to keep coming to the public were sexual blackmail operations, not unlike what Jeffrey Epstein was running. And then again, as I point out in part 2 of my series, the Iran-Contra network, I guess which is what I generally refer to it as, but this intelligence community that was involved in that scandal, they had a lot of links to other sexual blackmail operations in the 80s. And when some of those figures were targeted by congressional investigations, it was Bill Barr that justified their legal pardons in 1991. And then after that, he went back to the private sector, worked for Kirkland & Ellis, which is the firm that defended Epstein. So I think, any one of those would be a red flag, but all 3 together I think are concerning. And then you add in the fact that his father, hired Epstein at the Dalton School when Epstein did not have the credentials to work there. And one other really odd fact about Donald Barr is that right before he hired Epstein, he wrote a science fiction novel about human trafficking and sex slavery. So that is also another weird, but apparently, I would say somewhat relevant fact when we're looking at the big picture here. So, going forward, I don't really expect a full investigation. Bill Barr has refused to recuse himself. We also have the fact that the FBI, after Epstein's arrest, waited a really long time to raid several of the properties, including the property in the Virgin Islands, which they only raided after Epstein's death. To the best of my knowledge, the ranch in New Mexico that was Epstein's has still not been raided, giving people ample time to remove evidence or cover things up, especially if it is true what Alex Acosta said, that Epstein belonged or had links to intelligence, giving them plenty of time to cover up evidence. So I don't really, I don't expect all the truth to come out. I also worth pointing out that the fact that Epstein's death means that the criminal case against him goes away if no one else is charged. And that means that a lot of the evidence that was acquired during discovery or from the seizure of certain electronics will never be made public because that case will not be going forward now.
Oh, the fact that he's dead means they don't need a warrant as well to go into that New Mexico ranch. So it's troubling that they haven't. I have a million questions. I'm sure Elizabeth does too. I just want to get to the Broadway. Now, it has been talked about, and you've written that he had ties to intelligence agencies. The CIA and the Mossad have been mentioned. But what real credible hard evidence besides circumstantial evidence do we have to link him to any intelligence agency in a sexual blackmail operation? That's the idea. You need to gather in dirt on powerful people that the agencies could hold over this.
Okay, well, looking at Epstein's history itself, there's some red flags there. So one thing is that after he left Bear Stearns in 1981, he described himself to friends as working as a financial bounty hunter, basically hunting down money that powerful people, including powerful people in governments, had lost, and also hiding money for those same powerful people, presumably for tax evasion, and doing sort of all these financial tricks, as it were, and moving money from one place to another. Also during this time, according to Nigel Rosser, the British journalist who wrote in the Evening Standard in 2001, Epstein apparently for much of the 1990s claimed that he used to work for the CIA. And during this time in the early 1980s, one of his known clients, according to Vicky Ward, who's one of the journalists that's written extensively on Epstein even before his first arrest, said that one of his clients during this time was Adnan Khashoggi. Adnan Khashoggi, of course, is the one of the arms dealers that was really pivotal in the Iran-Contra scandal. And why he was doing that, in the late 70s, he had actually been recruited by the Mossad, and he was on Mossad payroll.
Ooh.
So if
I'm sorry, Epstein had a connection to Khashoggi. What was the connection?
He was working for Khashoggi as this financial bounty hunter type of deal. One of his clients was Adnan Khashoggi, who is known to work with intelligence agencies, and at the time Epstein was working with him, was on the payroll of the Mossad. That's according to Viktor Ostrovsky, who wrote By Way of Deception, the former Mossad agent.
Right. Well, I'm going to let Elizabeth take over in a second, but and I really want to get into the Iran-Contra angle in a moment, given its importance to our website. Bob Perry, of course, the founder, made some of the biggest Iran-Contra stories and gave the world a name all over North, for example. But if he were an intelligence asset, let's say, why did they abandon him now? Because in the first instance, in Florida case, he was given a slap on the wrist. This time they seemed serious. The judge didn't give him bail, and he was in jail, and it looked like he was going down. Why did they seem to have withdrawn their support, or did they?
Well, so I think one example that we can look at least on the historical record that may be relevant here to determine why would be what happened to Robert Maxwell, for example, who of course is Elaine Maxwell's father. He was known to be very connected to the Mossad and doing work for them for a large part of his career. And for instance, his purchase of the Daily Mirror Media Group was financed by Mossad-linked financiers, but at some point he became a liability for the Mossad. That's according to Gordon Thomas, who wrote Gideon's Spies and also wrote another biography about Robert Maxwell. And his work, along with the work of Mark Dillon, they make a convincing argument that Maxwell, his mysterious death on his yacht that was ruled a suicide, that a lot of people, including Maxwell's own family, have contested, was actually a murder, and that he had been taken out by the Mossad because he was more of a liability than an asset at that point. But they still gave him this, fancy state funeral, basically, that was attended by numerous Israeli heads of state and former and current heads of Israeli intelligence, and gave him full honors. But they wanted to take him out of the picture because they were worried that he, as I said, was more of a liability. He was demanding money to pay off his business debts because he'd been using this pension fund to fund his own activities, I guess you could say, but also to fund Mossad operations in Europe. He was involved in the sale of the Promise software that had a Mossad or had an Israeli intelligence backdoor planted into it. And even though he did all these things for Israel and Israeli intelligence, he behaved erratically and started demanding things from them and had threatened to expose them if they didn't give him the money that he wanted to bail out his businesses. So something may have happened in a similar way to Epstein. It's not exactly clear why he was arrested, and there's a lot of speculation, a lot of different theories as to why he was arrested in July, considering the timing. But I think, it would fit with a lot of the other people that have been involved in this network over time, that when they become a liability for whatever reason, if it's their own erratic behavior, or, some people have said that he may have been arrested because there was, a threat of like a mutiny at the FBI if they didn't go after him for certain reasons or something, that they wanted to, keep that, that they wanted to keep, I guess, the people below, like not the head honchos, right, but like people from, taking evidence out into the public or something. That's one theory I've heard, and that's why he was taken, why he was arrested. There may have been concern that he had become a liability, and that's why he, there were efforts to either cover this up, which would explain the delay in the FBI raids and things like that. And then if he was murdered or suicided, whatever anyone wants to believe about his death, that could have been done if he had become a liability, and he had intelligence ties.
Sorry, Elizabeth, I have to ask one more, then I'll turn it over to you for as long as you want. I heard one other theory, Whitney, and that is that after the collapse of the collusion theory and the Mueller official report, which said there was no collusion and the obstruction of justice attempt failed, that this was a way to try to get at Trump. The Southern District of New York has been looking into Trump's finances as a way to bring him down, and maybe they thought that they could get Epstein to spill the dirt that he had on Trump, and that I think the entire country would back, most of it anyway, an impeachment against Trump if it could be shown he'd engaged in this kind of abuse of underage girls, whereas that's kind of a non-political crime.
Right. Well, that's possible. Another political theory that's come up is this actually may have had more to do with Israeli political infighting, given the upcoming Israeli elections, that Ehud Barak is pitted against Netanyahu. Netanyahu is facing numerous corruption allegations, mainly related to bribery. But Ehud Barak didn't really have scandals at the time until Jeffrey Epstein was arrested in the full swing of the Israeli election cycle. And then when you compare bribery to someone having a several year lengthy association and friendship and business partnership with an accused pedophile sex trafficker, bribery stops looking so bad. And also there's the fact that Ehud Barak was also tied into Leslie Wexner and this mega group, or so-called mega donor group, who are at odds with Netanyahu currently, even though they previously backed him because they're mostly secular. Netanyahu was trying to sort of forge alliances with far-right religious elements in Israel that a lot of people in the mega group oppose, because most of them, as I said, are secular. Some are actually even atheists, like Michael Steinhardt, and are opposed to those sorts of religious extremist elements that Netanyahu's trying to court and is trying to make an alliance with, which is why there's elections now, because he was not able to form a coalition government previously. So that's another political theory that has been advanced as well. So I think there's a couple different angles there. But if there was an angle to go after Trump or make this something about US politics, I think that's definitely possible. But I think the fact that Epstein, at least his activities in the US, were so, his associations and friendships were very bipartisan, I think it's really hard to try and just laser target it to take down Trump and not end up taking down a large number of other people that were not the intended targets.
That's why I said at the beginning that both sides are going after this to get their targets. But Elizabeth, in a second, because at the beginning of the show, we talked about the congresswomen who the Israelis were not allowed to go to the West Bank. That decision by Netanyahu was reversed just a little while ago, and that probably had something to do with the election campaign as well. Elizabeth, please.
Yeah, a minute ago you were talking about the fact that Epstein, is one face of many kind of iterations of this same type of system, this blackmail system. And in your series, one of the people that you talk about as a central figure is kind of Roy Cohn. And you talk about Epstein sort of filling Cohn's shoes after Cohn died in the late 1980s. And I was wondering, do you think there is any face or any new replacement of Epstein as a figure in this kind of blackmail operation that you see coming up, or is there that sort of a vacuum waiting to be filled at this point?
No, I think there's definitely other Epsteins out there. Even when Roy Cohn was running his sexual blackmail operation, there were numerous others that sort of splintered off or worked with him. And a lot of the ones, a lot of these rings that I detail in parts 1 and part 2, they involved young boys. Epstein, of course, is known for targeting young girls. So I think even parallel with what Epstein was doing, there was very likely another Epstein that was involved in the trafficking and abuse and exploitation of young boys. And I think this sort of activity has gone on for decades, and there has been the CIA or intelligence or whoever's involved in this. We can, speculate exactly who has the most blame, but they've been allowed to do this with impunity for a matter of decades. I don't think they expect to be held to account now, and so I would expect those sort of activities to continue unless something dramatically changes.
So earlier, right before we started this interview, we were talking a little bit about the article that you are yet to publish, that will be published very soon, the fourth part of your series. Can you tell us a little bit about that and the focus that you're the focuses you're looking into in that story, and give us a little bit of a preview of it?
Okay, so what I'm going to be going into is more on the Iran-Contra side and showing how Democrats fit in here, because in a lot of my the previous installments of my series, I've mostly focused on Republicans, so I'm going to be tying in some Democrats, namely the Clinton family, because of course the Clintons were well known to have associated with Epstein. And I'm going to be tracing the earliest years of the Epstein-Clinton relationship, which actually go back to when Clinton was first in office in 1993, even though a lot of mainstream press reports like to say that it was after he left office. There's substantial evidence that this was much earlier. He was attending donor dinners for Clinton as early as 1993 with Elaine Maxwell, and that he was an important topic when powerful Clinton donors like Lynn Forrest or Rothschild would speak with Clinton at meetings in like 1995. One of the topics she would use in her short time of access to the president was to discuss Jeffrey Epstein, and this was in 1995. Right, so he was much more influential with Clinton than has been let on in the press for several years, and this is including the press coverage that came out after his arrest. And as I mentioned, the Iran-Contra network, the Clintons are definitely tied into that as well, but they're with what was going on at the MENA airport and their connections to people like Jackson Stevens, Hillary Clinton's connections to BCCI, and through her work at Rose Law Firm in Arkansas and some other things like that. So I'll be tying them into the bigger picture too of the network that I'm discussing. And I will also be talking about Mark Rich, who is another mega group connected businessman. One mega group connected businessman I already talked about in part 3 of my series was Robert Maxwell, but I didn't get to Mark Rich yet. And I'll be talking about him because of course he was pardoned by Clinton in Clinton's last days of office. And so he has some relevance to this network I'm describing and how this sort of blackmail operation has advanced, though, because Clinton, allegedly part of the reason he pardoned Mark Rich was because he had been targeted by Israeli espionage. And so, for example, with the Monica Lewinsky scandal, for example, the first person that knew of that scandal allegedly was Netanyahu, who was prime minister at the time and claimed to have tapes of phone conversations that Clinton had with Monica Lewinsky and attempted to use that to influence him. And of course, the Mark Rich pardon was largely sought by members of the mega group like Michael Steinhardt, who used to be an investment partner of Mark Rich. And Ehud Barak, of course, who we know is a close friend, or was a close friend, he's trying to distance himself now from Jeffrey Epstein.
As detailed in your articles, there's almost an infinitude of connections of the rich, powerful, and incredibly wealthy individuals. So I know that Joe asked about this earlier, but I'd like to ask again. So what are some of the additional intelligence ties that Epstein had that you may either have written about in your piece already or will publish in this new article?
Okay, well, the ones I haven't published yet are going to be the one I already mentioned, which is in the 1980s. He said he told people later in the 90s he was working for the CIA and that he was working with people like Adnan Khashoggi. Of course, the other main intelligence connection would be his partner in crime, as it were, Elaine Maxwell, whose father was a known Mossad operative. And they teamed up and were working together by at least 1993, but they met in 1991 because Elaine Maxwell left England for New York shortly after her father's death. And she has often been, before her father died, she was involved in a lot of his business activities, including his shadier business activities, on a lot of his somewhat suspect yacht parties. She was frequently present with a lot of highly influential people from the United States and Israel and England. So she's been in sort of the swamp, as it were, for a very long time. And she was definitely very involved in the sexual blackmail operation that later came out of this partnership and went forward. We also know that by 1993, Epstein was able to get himself out of significant legal trouble. In 1987, he had teamed up with Steve Hoffenberg and had been employed by Tower Financial, which collapsed in 1993 in one of the largest Ponzi schemes in U.S. history. And Epstein, according to Hoffenberg and according to substantial internal evidence from Tower Financial, had really been the brains behind this Ponzi scheme and was named in the case. And when this came to light in 1993, his name was dropped from the case and he wasn't prosecuted, but Hoffenberg was, despite the overwhelming evidence that Epstein had been intimately involved, even though he had left the company prior to its implosion. So that implies then that he was already getting these sort of sweetheart deals because he had friends in high places, it could be said, right? And this was before we don't know then that his sexual operation, blackmail operation had begun in earnest, but it appears that he had already developed these connections by this time. Another thing that I think is circumstantial but notable is how he acquired his New York townhouse. And this, of course, was given to him by Leslie Wexner. Leslie Wexner bought the New York townhouse in 1989. He bought it for $13 million. And he spent millions of dollars more refurbishing it, putting all this expensive art in it. And he also installed a very odd bathroom that was hidden under the stairs. It was lined with lead to prevent electronic surveillance from coming in or out. And if you open the cabinets in this so-called bathroom, there was CCTV, all this recording equipment and things like that, that showed, all the different rooms in the house and was capable of recording things that were going on in that house. And that was before Epstein even lived in that house. And Wexner, by his own admission, never lived there. So this man, this powerful billionaire, spent millions of dollars basically making a fancy furnished spy house, basically, with CCTV, and then he gives it to Epstein. According to a 1996 New York Times article, Epstein was already living in that house and had been for a few years. So we don't know exactly when he began to live there, but it appears to be around the same time, 1993, when he was, associating with the Clintons and had gotten out of this lawsuit and whatnot. And then going forward in the years after, this house is transferred to Epstein, or a trust that Epstein owned, for $1. So it was basically given to him for free. And of course, there's a lot has been said about where did Epstein's wealth come from, and was he really a billionaire? The more people that have looked into this, the more it has become clear that his wealth, he was made to look wealthy. A lot of his alleged hedge fund, where this wealth was supposed to have come from, people on Wall Street, when they were asked about it, said they'd never heard of it, they'd never done business with it. By all appearances, it didn't exist. And so beyond that, his wealth was supposed to have come from his financial consulting service, but his only known client was Leslie Wexner. So by all appearances, it appears that he was given, he was made to look rich, and all of his assets he was essentially given. And that, to me, sort of, and his association with Elaine Maxwell and his past suggests that this very well could have been an intelligence operation, especially considering the nature of the activity that he was collecting, blackmail and trying to get powerful people, and not just politicians, celebrities, scientists, a lot of other prominent people into compromising positions. And Ghislaine Maxwell and Epstein would brag about all the material he had accumulated that was compromising of so many people. So I think, when you take everything together, and in addition to the fact that Alex Acosta said the reason he approved the sweetheart deal originally was that Epstein had ties to intelligence, I think it makes a convincing case. There was definitely involvement of intelligence agencies here. As to whether the CIA was more involved or the Mossad was more involved is really difficult to know, but I think there is definitely involvement of both to some extent. Both agencies are known to very much seek out blackmail and acquire much of it as possible. Not that they're unique in that, but they're definitely known for having used sexual blackmail operations for decades, particularly with prostitutes. But what we're seeing here with Epstein and some of the other cases that I point out in my reports is that there are also ones that involve children or underage people, because obviously if someone is blackmailed with a prostitute, well, then that looks, lewd and it's adultery if they're married. But if it's them with a child, I mean, obviously there's no way to come back from that in a political career. So it's definitely a different level of leverage that you would obtain there, but there is no justification for any intelligence agency to use a child in this sort of activity. So I think that's part of why this is being covered up. Or rather that the mainstream media is specifically distracting from this or trying to minimize this intelligence angle because it would mean that intelligence agencies are involved in the abuse and exploitation of children when there's no justifiable reason to do so. You can't say, oh yeah, we're running a pedophile ring in the interest of national security. No one's going to believe that.
Absolutely. No, it's fascinating in its horror. But I was also going to ask you, what about these documents, the 2,000 plus documents that were released within 24 hours before Epstein died? Have you been able to look through those, and have you found anything that is new or interesting or of significance at this time? Or, do you think that maybe the release of those documents had anything whatsoever to do with Epstein's death, as it were?
Well, it was a partial release, and I believe this was the partial release that was being sought by people like Alan Dershowitz and I believe Mike Cernovich's lawyer, and people like that. And originally, Alan Dershowitz and I guess you could say his allies in getting this partial, not full release of this case, it was a civil case, was aimed at getting more information about the victims that had come forward and information that could have been used to target them. Because of course we know that Alan Dershowitz has been on a lengthy media campaign to try and discredit all of the claims against him, and the fact that he has been accused of raping some of Epstein's victims, in some cases multiple times, and he's been trying to widely discredit as much as possible, and this was believed to have been, he felt there was something in this case that he was specifically requesting as part of this partial release could improve his case, and there's a reason he was asking for the partial, not the full disclosure of that. So I think that's significant. And I also think it's significant that a day after that's released, Epstein is killed or is found dead, rather. Sorry.
No, it's totally fine. I think it's really difficult to kind of, go along with the idea that he committed suicide, but that's a whole other discussion. And I also think that we could have an entire interview just about the role of Mike Cernovich in trying to get those documents released as well. I mean, that's a huge topic of conversation. But there's one kind of tangential subject I wanted to ask you about, because you mentioned his role not only in the rich and powerful, but also in medical sciences. He donates to Harvard. He has a lot of scientific friends and ties. I wanted to ask you about I believe it's the Jeffery Epstein 4 Foundation, the scientific foundation that he runs. And have you covered that? Will you cover that? Has anyone really discussed that foundation to date in relation to this scandal?
Well, I think some people have looked at the money flow, because as I mentioned, it's hard to know where his wealth came from, but it's much easier to see what he spent his money on. And he definitely spent a lot of time in philanthropy, and that actually, I argue in my piece, has been used by a lot of powerful businessmen to sort of cover up their more, unpleasant activities, I guess you could say, that by donating heavily to different causes, in Epstein's case, mostly science, one can say, I am a philanthropist, and it sort of distracts from all the other activity that he's doing, because then they don't have to look into, is he really a hedge fund manager? They can just say, financier and philanthropist. And this was what was done with Epstein well before his first arrest as well. For example, Bill Clinton, when he was asked about Epstein, prior to Epstein's arrest, said, he's a great philanthropist, right? So it definitely provides cover for activity in some sense. And this really goes back to the days of J.D. Rockefeller, when Rockefeller's public reputation was very negative because of how much he owned and how powerful he was. He started donating to certain causes to rebrand himself in the press as a philanthropist. Specifically as to his foundations, my series is mostly looking at the history of what was going on here and trying to place Jeffrey Epstein in the context of a larger network that was known to also use these operations, and the ties between what he was doing and the ties to these other rings that were known to have existed. So my series is mostly stopping around the time frame of like 2001, more or less, with some discussion of Epstein's connections to people like Bill Clinton into the present, just to underscore that this was a relationship that continued beyond that. I do believe some people have done reporting on his financials, but a lot of this has come from outlets like the Daily Beast and things like that have been very aggressive about getting those types of financial records. And it hasn't really shown, much shady activity. It just mostly shown what he was giving causes to. Though the New York Times recently reported an article, reported that there may have been an ulterior motive to his extreme interest in science, which was the fact that he had a strong interest in transhumanism and eugenics, and that he had planned to use his his ranch in New Mexico to basically try and create a master race of people by taking it's very bizarre. I don't even just read the New York Times article for yourself about what Jeffrey Epstein told scientists he was interested in doing, and what parts of his body he wanted cryogenically frozen to use in the future. It's quite bizarre, so I'd rather not get into that. You can look into that for yourself and speculate as to what he was interested in when it came to the sciences, but definitely not a normal interest in scientific advancement.
I think,
Definitely.
I think they meant philanderer, not philanthropist. Isn't that right?
I think that, well, I mean, these were in press reports, things like that. I think that would have been more accurate. But as I try and point out, and as I mentioned earlier, a lot of people have tried to use this philanthropic or philanthropist label to kind of distract from other things they were doing. So, for example, Samuel Bronfman, who I talk about a little bit in my piece, he was, during Prohibition in Canada, he gained sort of a nasty reputation for his ties to the mob, specifically the American mob and Mayor Lansky. And he always wanted this sort of high society prestige. He wanted to be a university president or a senator. And because of his ties to the mob, that prevented him from doing so. So he attempted to rebrand as a philanthropist, giving a lot of his money, or a lot of his ill-gotten wealth, rather, away to philanthropic causes, sort of allowing the media to rehabilitate his image and allow him to sort of gain that high society prestige that he had always wanted.
So you've revealed Wexler's secret, this bathroom, where I guess no one should take a shower because the steam might affect electronics in there.
I don't think it had a shower. It was just like a small bathroom with a toilet and a sink and some cabinets, but you open the cabinets and there's all this bizarre stuff there. But another secret of Wexler's that hasn't really gotten much media attention is his ties to organized crime. A 1985 police report in Columbus, Ohio, revealed that he was the main transporter of his goods at the limited company, had strong ties to the Genovese crime family, which of course ties into Mayor Lansky as well, and the National Crime Syndicate, which is actually a crime network that has a lot of connections to the mega group, including family connections. Michael Steinhardt, who I mentioned earlier, his father was Mayor Lansky's personal jewel. So, but Wexner in particular has been able to sort of cover up his ties to organized crime quite effectively. And actually that 1985, that investigation to that 1985 murder was actually covered up by the police commissioner, because after the investigation concluded, he preferred to leave the murder unsolved and not go forward with the conclusion of the investigation, because he considered the conclusion of the investigation to be libelous. That was his word. And of course, the report was not supposed to come out. Oh, sorry.
What murder are you talking about? I'm sorry.
The murder of Arthur Shapiro in Columbus, Ohio, who was a lawyer that at the time of his death was representing Leslie Wexner's company, L Brands.
Wexner, of course, is the creator of Victoria's Secret, hence my...
Well, he purchased it from someone else, but yeah, he owns Victoria's Secret, Bath & Body Works, Abercrombie & Fitch, a lot of well-known mall brands to people in the United States. A lot of them having to do with intimate clothing or preteen clothing. He's also been accused of raping Epstein's victims as well, Leslie Wexner.
Before I go into the Iran-Contra a little bit, and the history of this network that you seem to be showing as a thread from Lansky's days all the way to... how do you feel about the New York Times coverage on that? They've done a lot, and they've written a lot about Wexner as well. On the whole, how would you grade their coverage of this story?
Oh, of Wexner's creation to Epstein, his connection to Epstein.
Coverage of the whole Epstein story. How would you rate that?
Well, I don't know. It would take me a while to settle on a number between 1 and 10 or something like that, but I do definitely have concerns about it. I think they focused on more sensational aspects. Like, as I mentioned, the sort of New Mexico ranch eugenics angle was one of their recent stories on Jeffrey Epstein. But when it came to, his billionaire friends and his powerful allies, they published stories saying that Epstein was solely responsible for that, and that the billionaires had been hoodwinked and deceived by Epstein. They didn't know what was going on, and sort of offsetting all the blame that people like Leslie Wexner would have had, or any or prior knowledge or things like that of what he was doing. And I think that is total bunk. As I pointed out earlier, Wexner gave him this townhouse with all the spy equipment already in it. Also, Epstein was in 1996 contracted an artist named Maria Farmer to do, I believe, a mural or some sort of artwork in one of Wexner's mansions in Ohio, and then Epstein sexually assaulted her. She called the police and tried to leave, but it was Wexner's personal security guards that prevented her from leaving for 12 hours. So to say that Wexner had no idea that Epstein was into this sort of stuff and had this sort of behavior and had no idea that what was going on, the evidence does not support that, but the New York Times had sort of put the spin sort of to protect his powerful allies and billionaires, and these billionaires, of association with Epstein, allowing them to more successfully distance themselves from him by saying, oh, we didn't know, and he was so charming and manipulative that he just deceived us. I think that is actually a very damaging narrative, frankly, because it allows them to evade accountability when some of them clearly knew.
I think the Times did seem to imply that by raising the question, how did Epstein get all this money from Wexner? How did he get in charge of his finances suddenly? And what was Wexner getting in return? And the implication is he was getting his services, if I can call it that, with these young girls.
Well, some people have said that, but I didn't really get that from the New York Times. I mean, I think they were more saying like, they definitely gave a lot of lip service to Wexner's own excuse, which is like, I had no idea that he was doing this stuff with my money, and I only found out recently that we had been, that he had like pilfered funds from our foundation, because he was on the board of the Wexner Foundation, and all of this other stuff, and attempted to say, we didn't know he was doing anything wrong, but as soon as we discovered it, we fired him, and we ended our association with him and all of this stuff. But
I'm just wondering if you were surprised that the Times hasn't pursued the Trump angle more on this. I am.
Well, I think the New York Times knows that the more, if you pull on some of these threads, a lot of information powerful people don't want to come out will come out. So I think that's what, but I think on another level, I think, as you mentioned earlier, we've seen sort of the weaponization of the Epstein case for partisan gain on both sides. And that's been particularly true on the right, where they're saying like, oh, it's only Epstein and Clinton, or oh, it's only Epstein and Trump. I think both of those are really damaging in the sense that it distracts from the fact that this is a bipartisan issue. And that Epstein was close to people, on both sides. And it's really just being, weaponized to sort of exacerbate the divisive nature of American politics today, instead of actually trying to get to the bottom of what was actually going on. So I don't really like that narrative. And I think also the New York Times is trying to perhaps remain sort of out of that partisan pushing. Maybe they, did so for, political points to avoid being attacked by the president. I mean, who knows? But I also would like to point out that Trump's ties to the Epstein network date back to Roy Cohn. Roy Cohn had a lot of powerful friends in New York, and also some powerful columnist friends at the New York Times. So I think if they were to go after Trump and sort of highlight Epstein's ties to Trump dating back to the late 80s and early 90s, that they would also air out a lot of dirty laundry that people in New York, where the New York Times, of course, is based, do not want coming out.
All right, so let's move to the historical nature of your story, and then I want to ask you about Iran-Contra a little more. You seem to be implying that this sexual blackmail network, which of course have existed in all countries, all kinds of intelligence agencies, but that you seem to be saying, I could be wrong, that there's a direct link between the early days of Lansky and intelligence all the way up to including Epstein. Is that right? And how does Epstein fit into that?
Okay, so yeah, it takes a lot of time to sort of explain and make this case, which is why my article, originally I was just going to make a 2-part article, and it has now turned into 4 because there's a lot of stuff there. But basically, the overview, this sort of sexual blackmail operation as it has been conducted in the United States, it was pioneered not by intelligence agencies, it was pioneered by the mob. specifically the National Crime Syndicate, which basically took over American organized crime networks by joining up the Jewish mob and the Italian mobs in the early 20s, allowing them to sort of join forces and consolidate control. And this was done by Lucky Luciano and Mayor Lansky. We know that, according to Virginia Hill, who was like the mistress of the mob, so to speak, and Bugsy Siegel's girlfriend, that she had been sent by Mayor Lansky to Mexico to try and entrap foreign diplomats there in bugged hotel rooms to acquire blackmail. And we also know that during World War II, there was Operation Underworld, where the OSS, the forerunner to the CIA, forged an illicit alliance, if you will, with organized crime, specifically Lansky and Luciano. And that actually, even though it was supposed to be out of wartime necessity, that alliance continued decades later and arguably still today. It especially became strong in the 1960s when the CIA put a lot of people that were associated with Lansky in assassination teams and tried to use, those connections to overthrow Fidel Castro in Cuba. But going back to the days of the OSS, we know that Lansky and William Donovan, who was director of the OSS, were exchanging blackmail specifically on J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover was sort of in this battle of wills with Donovan because he wanted the OSS to basically go away after the war. He didn't want it to be established as a permanent agency because he was afraid that would limit his power as FBI director. So they tried, Hoover and Donovan tried to get the worst blackmail on the other one, and Donovan, with the help of the mob, acquired the superior blackmail, as it were, on Hoover, of him being engaged in sexual relationships with one of his top aides at the time, Clyde Tolson. And of course, at that time, being caught in a secret homosexual relationship was very politically damaging, very different than today, because of course this was the 1940s. And so that is, one example of how organized crime and the CIA were sharing intelligence, but really blackmail, going back to the days of their first alliance, and this continued well on into the, arguably into the present. So moving forward, eventually, as I point out in part one of my series, in the beginning of the 1950s, there was a sexual blackmail ring involving boys that involved Louis Rosenstiel, who's another Mayor Lansky businessman, who was the owner of Shenley Liquors, and he had a very cozy relationship with J. Edgar Hoover. Actually, J. Edgar Hoover's, I think, one of his longtime aides, Louis Nichols, was given the #2 post, plus lots of lucrative stock options at Rosenstiel's company. And Roy Cohn was also involved in this as well. And Rosenstiel was originally running a sort of a mob-linked sexual blackmail operation out of his house. And this was later expanded, and Roy Cohn, who was general counsel to McCarthy during this time, eventually took it over and began to run it out of the Plaza Hotel in Manhattan, in a suite that became rather infamous, but in hushed tones nonetheless. That was Suite 233. And it was later revealed by court documents, a divorce court ruling, the early 1970s New York investigation into organized crime, and also an admission of guilt, basically, by Roy Cohn to James Rothstein, who was one of the NYPD detectives in charge of the Human Trafficking Division, that Roy Cohn indeed was involved in trafficking young boys for the purposes of sexual blackmail, and that had begun as part of this anti-communist crusade that began in the McCarthy era and was used to get either people to go along with McCarthyism or to leverage it for political, to basically threaten people with, if you don't do what we want, we'll take you down as either part of the McCarthy hearings or just, make these pictures public and give it to our friends in the press. As I point out in part 2 of my series, Roy Cohn was extremely connected to pretty much almost every mainstream outlet of the period. His childhood friends, for example, one of them was the publisher of the National Enquirer. The other one was the owner of Condé Nast magazines, which includes the New Yorker, GQ, Esquire, Vanity Fair, a bunch of other magazines. He was also very close with William Buckley, a very prominent conservative journalist, William Safire, who worked for the New York Times. One of his closest friends was Barbara Walters. And he was also close friends with Rupert Murdoch, and actually it was Roy Cohn, as Bob Perry reported, right? It was Roy Cohn that got Rupert Murdoch connected to the Reagan White House. So he was definitely super tied into the press, and able to weaponize that, not just to protect his own operations, but to use it to threaten other people if blackmail didn't work. And he was also able to kill stories just by calling the media moguls that he was close to.
Well, where does that?
Okay, so this is just the history of this operation at Roy Cohn. So that takes us to part one. In part two of my series, I point out how Roy Cohn and intelligence agencies during this time, including this Iran-Contra network, which, as I mentioned earlier, Epstein was appeared to have been connected to in the early 1980s. They were running a lot of, there was a lot of sexual blackmail operations connected to that network, some of which came to be known in the press, and a lot of them had direct connections to Roy Cohn. So, for example, Craig Spence, who was a conservative Washington lobbyist, who was he ran the infamous White House callboy ring, it's sometimes called, because some of the boys he exploited, he would take on midnight tours of the White House. He was known to host birthday parties for Roy Cohn at his house. He claimed that Roy Cohn was one of his close friends. He also claimed to be close friends with William Casey, CIA director at the time that most of his activities were going on. And he was, you know, his whole house, he would host these parties in his house, and his house was known to, was later revealed to have been heavily bogged with electronic equipment. Craig Spence also claimed to have worked for the CIA and claimed to have been involved to some extent in drug smuggling during that period. Of course, we know that that was definitely going on, that the CIA was definitely involved in that with Iran-Contra. Among other things, that drug smuggling was definitely part of that, and some of that cocaine would appear at parties Spence hosted at his house, and he would also use that as blackmail for people that did not engage the minors he had at the premises. He would, you know, photograph or film them using illegal drugs, basically, in this period. While conveniently the Reagan administration was doing this, so just say no to drugs and the drug war and all of that, which of course meant if you were shown partaking in cocaine, it would have been very politically damaging at the time. And when people were investigating Craig Spence, they found another sex ring that was being run out of Nebraska that was run by Larry King, who had connections to several Iran-Contra connections, and actually the front of his sex ring was a credit union that was being used to sort of launder Iran-Contra money as well. And there's a few other ones that I lay out in my piece as well, and there's some other Iran-Contra connections, but those are the big two. It was known during that time that Spence and King, their rings were actually connected, and they operated under an umbrella group that was called Bodies by God, or that was the code name for it, according to intelligence sources that had been quoted by John DeCamp, who was one of the main investigators, and a former Nebraska state senator that really looked into the Franklin case. Taking that into consideration, Epstein's connections to intelligence in the 1980s, going forward in his ties to Elaine Maxwell, a lot of these rings that I just mentioned were broken up or were exposed pretty much right around the same time that Epstein appeared to have gotten involved in this sort of activities, around like 1993 or so. By that time, the Franklin scandal had already been covered up. I believe it was exposed in the early 90s. What Craig Spence was doing was exposed between 1989 and 1990, and I think because of the connections that the connections that intelligence was, was known to have been involved in this sort of stuff, and that Epstein himself had some connection to Iran-Contra figures, and was powerfully connected enough to different people, including the Clintons, who also had a role in Iran-Contra to some extent. I think it makes a convincing case, knowing what Epstein was later up to, that he may have, it's very possible and very likely that he may have been in iteration of this, sort of dynasty, I guess you could say, of sexual blackmail operations that date back decades. But it's hard to know exactly how this network developed. What we do know is that from, this one that began in the 1950s, it grew and it splintered and it expanded. A lot of the ones that I mentioned previously, they involve mostly boys. So the Franklin one in Nebraska involved boys and girls. And going beyond that, it's hard to know. As I mentioned earlier, this sort of, this leads me to think that Epstein was not an isolated case. and that there were people that were exploiting boys while he was exploiting girls, or there may have been one that exploited boys and girls at the same time. It's really hard to know exactly how the division in, exactly what types of pedophile rings these people are into and how many of them are, because of course all of this, this is not something the CIA or any other intelligence agency, whether it's the CIA or the Mossad, would publicly admit to being involved to. So we just have to go from the evidence of what we know. And based on that, and the fact that we know now that Epstein had intelligence ties, and that's how he got that 2008 sweetheart deal, I think that if we look at his history and we look at the people he was connected to, that he was a part of this network. I think I make a convincing case for that in my reports. It's hard to sort of expand on all the connections here in an interview because there's a lot of them. So anyone that's interested in seeing how all this connects together in a broader way, I would encourage to read my reports.
Well, okay, now Acosta was the prosecutor in Florida that gave the sweetheart deal, and then he became Trump's labor secretary and had to resign when this scandal broke recently. What exactly did Acosta claim to have said when he was in the interview for the job at the Trump in the Trump transition team? What did he say about Epstein's connections to intelligence?
Well, he was intentionally very vague. I mean, they basically just asked him why he had approved the deal, and he said, "Oh, I was told Epstein was above intelligence. He's above my pay grade," and he just let it go and approved it. I mean, what we do know is that in U.S. political circles, people that are willing to turn a blind eye to certain things often get promoted. This is also true in the mainstream press. You know, if you're willing to toe the line that people ask of you, generally it leads to promotions. If Acosta, for example, had said, "I don't care that he's tied to intelligence, I'm going to prosecute this guy because he's a pedophile sex trafficker," I really doubt that he would have been promoted to labor secretary.
Well, but because of that, he got axed as labor secretary. So it came back to bite him in the end. Tell me more about the Clintons' connection to Iran-Contra, if you can.
Sure. So the Clintons, one of the main hubs, I guess you could say, in the United States for a lot of this stuff that was going on with Iran-Contra happened in Arkansas. This was through people like Barry Seal and Terry Reid and some other CIA operatives, or some of them like Barry Seal were DEA and CIA dual operatives. And this was being run out of rural Arkansas. And, you know, there were people in Mena Airport. There was apparently drugs that were coming from South America. There were also people, because not that far from Mena, there was, I forget the name of a national forest, but there's a national forest like 10 miles north of there. And that's where Nicaraguan Contras and some other Latin American, I guess, paramilitary recruits were trained by people like Oliver North and people that were working for him. Barry Seal and Terry Reid had associations, or were in Reid's case, were directly working for Oliver North during that time. And Terry Reid later said that a lot of the drug money that was coming in or coming back or resulting from the sale of this stuff was laundered by financial institutions in Arkansas during that time. And there have been plenty of reports pointing the connections of those financial institutions to the Clintons. Another Iran-Contra figure that was involved in the BCCI bank, which is the CIA-linked bank that was involved in a lot of money laundering for Iran-Contra, was very connected to Jackson Stevens, who was a major political backer, not just of Ronald Reagan, but also of Bill Clinton in Arkansas politics. And actually, it was Hillary Clinton who represented many of his business interests in Arkansas through Rose Law Firm. And actually, she was one of the lawyers that helped bring BCCI, which was originally founded in Pakistan, that brought it to the United States, allowing it to be heavily involved in Iran-Contra money laundering, and also the money laundering and funding of terrorists as well, and a lot of other things that this bank did before it got sort of exposed for its illicit activities. So she was directly involved in that. And also another thing that I talk about in my report is the Promise software scandal. And Jackson Stevens, to an extent, was also involved in that because he had a company called Systematics, and that was also basically the main developer of the stolen promise software for use of financial espionage, which was used by the intelligence during that time to track money transfers and things like that, and also protect detection of illicit money transfers the CIA was doing during that time. And that was a company that was owned by Jackson Stevens. And during the litigation of the promise case, Systematics was represented by Rose Law Firm, specifically Hillary Clinton and Vince Foster were involved in that case. So there's a couple other connections to this network here. This is all going to the 1980s. But allegedly, Bill Casey, or Bill Barr told Bill Clinton that he was Bill Casey's fair-haired boy, like Bill Casey really liked him and all this stuff during this time. And there's some other really crazy stuff that was alleged to have been overheard by some people working for the CIA and some people that were at that conversation, or that heard that conversation firsthand, that I'll be including in my report.
Wait a minute. Barr said that Clinton was Casey's fair-haired boy, or Barr was?
No, that Clinton was Casey's fair-haired boy because of his willingness to lend Arkansas to the service of Iran-Contra and intelligence, and of course Hillary Clinton's work in handling the legal angle that helped advance CIA objectives during that time.
This quote, where did you get that quote from Barr?
I'd have to look it up. It's in the article I'm writing right now. Is there any way to pause the recording?
No.
No. So I'll it'll be in my report when it comes out. It's from a book that was written by someone with direct knowledge of this. So I'm sorry. So I name my report. It's hard to remember them all.
I'm going to turn
You've got thousands of links in these articles, so no worries whatsoever.
Yeah, I can send it to you after the interview.
My last question about the suicide now. Clearly, there are a lot of people, and you've mentioned a bunch of them, who would rather that Epstein did not go to trial and a lot of facts would emerge that could implicate them. Now, the coroner's report has now come up with this apparently fact that a couple of bones in his throat had been broken, and that normally indicates strangulation rather than hanging, although in an older person, it could also mean hanging. So the way I see it is, if in fact this did happen, he may have been allowed to try a second time, and this time successfully, by somehow getting the guards not to go there, creating the conditions for him to kill himself. On the other hand, it could have just been a screw-up in the prison. Can't rule that out, can we?
There are a couple of things I'd like to point out here. One thing is that this prison, just last year, a prison guard there was convicted for taking $50,000 in bribes to smuggle things in that prison. And this is something that happens in other prisons. It is not exclusive to this prison, but I think that, strengthens the case that if Epstein did commit suicide, he was allowed to commit suicide, or he was offered help to commit suicide, because officially the story is that he hung himself from the bed, but pictures that have been released of the cell he was in show that bed basically being a concrete slab. Inmates that have been in that prison, or former inmates that have been in that prison, say that the sheets are like paper thin. Epstein was 6 feet tall and over 200 pounds. I find it unlikely that he was able to hang himself with a paper thin sheet and end up breaking bones in the process. I find that I don't really believe that. I think if he did commit suicide, he was allowed to perhaps bring in a stronger sheet, if that were the case, for example. But I think a lot of people were interested in the criminal case against them going away. So, for example, after news of his suicide broke, Prince Andrew, who was quite stressed out apparently by his implication in the Epstein scandal, was all smiles the next day. Not that I'm saying that the royal family was involved, but that's just an example that people that were connected to Epstein were very relieved by his death, especially the ones that had their names heavily implicated in the scandal and had gotten a lot of media attention as a result, including people like Prince Andrew and Alan Dershowitz and the Clintons and things like that.
Andrew has stepped down now from any public role, that's what I understand, probably pressure from his mother. So I lied. I have one final question of Elaine Maxwell. Could she be sort of the the indicator about whether there's going to be a serious investigation if they actually pursue this woman. A photograph emerged that was in the New York Post. Impossible to tell when it was taken, whether it was staged or not, of her in a hamburger joint in L.A. Do you think that they're going to go after her? And if they don't, what does that tell you?
No, I don't think they're going to actually go after her. As part of the sweetheart deal, apparently that protected co-conspirators from criminal charges. So as long as that stands, that sweetheart deal stands, it's unlikely that she will be charged, and that's apparently the reason why she hasn't been charged, even though that Epstein was later arrested. I think also, there's a lot of oddities in this investigation and this case. One example, I said it earlier, was the extreme delays in raiding the residences of Jeffrey Epstein. And the fact that Ghislaine was never even really questioned by the FBI, and if they really are, as they have said, continuing a criminal investigation into the sex ring, they should at least take her in for questioning. They have not done so. For the federal government to act like they don't know where Elaine Maxwell is, I think is absurd, considering the extent of surveillance on the American civilian populace. The NSA knows where she is, and if they don't, some other intelligence agency does if she's not in the United States. What I think we're seeing now in the mainstream media is an attempt to paint Ghislaine Maxwell as if she were Carmen Sandiego. She just keeps popping up all over the country and no one knows where she is. And they're just making headlines out of it like, oh, Ghislaine cited here. What I want to stress is that according to victims, Ghislaine Maxwell is a horrible human being and is an alleged child rapist, a serial sex trafficker, and a serial abuser. When some of these young girls were taken and brought into this ring and they refused to have sex with Jeffrey Epstein, it was Ghislaine Maxwell that took away their passports, right? So, this is a horrible human being, and the fact that the press is, playing this game of, look, here she is now, and she's in Boston, no, she's in LA, no, she's here, I think is gross, personally, because it's like they're making this into a media spectacle and sort of just saying, oh, she's, Epstein's girlfriend. I mean, I think that's really minimizing what she's accused of, for one thing. And I think it's sort of just, I sort of think, this photo, right, was clearly, she posed for it, had a picture of her with a book talking about the lives and deaths of CIA operatives. And it's just, to me, just an in-your-face sort of message, like, I'm untouchable. I think that's what that was meant to say. Or it was some sort of message that, either she or people connected to her wanted to put out in the press. There is no way of knowing when this photo was taken. There is no date on the photo. In the New York, I believe the New York Post published this originally. They don't say exactly when it was taken. They just say it was taken recently. I think this is a way of toying with people and trying to distract from the real issue at hand. And I think we're seeing that a lot with a lot of the Epstein coverage right now. There's being efforts to distract from major angles of the case, especially the intelligence angle of all of this. Aside from the fact with Ghislaine posing with this book, I think it needs to be highlighted that he was working for some intelligence agency.
Now, you did tell us earlier how her father apparently ticked off the Mossad and then they withdrew the protection, may have even had him murdered. But did you explain why again? And if you did, I've forgotten, sorry. Why Epstein suddenly had his protection removed? Did he tick off somebody? Why did they have him arrested and not giving him bail? That kind of thing.
Well, I don't think it's really known exactly, because even after he left prison, after the sweetheart deal, he was still associating with a lot of the same people and a lot of his same business partners. And he was actually advising prominent Silicon Valley companies like Tesla. Right. So he definitely he was a pariah in public, perhaps, but in private, he was not. So a lot of his activities during the period leading up to his arrest were not exactly known. Though a few months prior, I think maybe even 1 or 2 months prior to his arrest, his longtime relationship with Deutsche Bank abruptly ended. He was known for decades to have been very interested in currency trading, and I would argue actually currency manipulation. Because of his past, and also one of the things that Lynn Forrester de Rothschild talked to the Clintons about in relation with Jeffrey Epstein at a 1995 meeting was Jeffrey Epstein and currency stabilization together, right? So he was known to have used Deutsche Bank for currency trading. Lynn Forrester de Rothschild, by the way, during that time was an advisor to Deutsche Bank, but Deutsche Bank abruptly ended their connection with Epstein not long before his arrest, and it wasn't exactly said why. So apparently, I'm just going to assume here that Deutsche Bank knew either something was coming or that Epstein took money from the wrong people or did the wrong sort of trade and may have kicked people off in the financial world. I think that is one possibility that hasn't really been explored, but I think is an avenue worth exploring since it only precedes the arrest by a relatively short window of time. And as I said, a lot of his business dealings, specifically in the past 2 years, aren't exactly known. So for example, he was known to be advising the company Tesla last year, and specifically Elon Musk, and was trying to sort of get Saudi investors for Tesla. He apparently had a close relationship with MBS, Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia, who of course has only risen to prominence in Saudi Arabia in the past few years. So a lot of what Epstein was doing was going on behind the scenes. So it's hard to know exactly what was going on, but because, what's unique about Epstein and the sexual blackmail operation is that before he got involved in this, he was known to be doing a lot of shady financial activity, like I mentioned in the 1980s, doing hiding money for people like Adnan Khashoggi and African dictators and things like that. And from all appearances, why he was doing this stuff and with sexual blackmail operations would occasionally do this on the side, as evidenced by his activities with Deutsche Bank. So I think after his arrest, obviously, it would have been much harder for him to continue his sexual blackmail and sexual trafficking activities. So I think he may have gotten back into the worlds of finance, and there is evidence to support that. And I think he may have perhaps misstepped there or angered certain people in those activities. But as I said, a lot of this went on in private because no one wants to admit that they're being advised by Epstein. It only really came out after he died, specifically that he was advising Tesla, for example, was told to a reporter off the record. And after he died, that person assumed that off the record didn't matter anymore. And it was reported. So I think, that should be what people should potentially look into to find out exactly why he was, taken down, first arrested, and perhaps killed in this way, that it may have had something to do with financial, it may have had some sort of financial link. Let's also remember, too, that Deutsche Bank is in a lot of scandals right now. A lot of people think it could collapse. And it's also been accused of money laundering in more than one probe. So, I think that is something that someone with better knowledge of what's going on in Deutsche Bank right now should perhaps pursue. And there may be yet more links to what was going on with Jeffrey Epstein that may explain his recent arrest.
This is my last question. My feeling was that he realized he was at the end of the road. He lived in what was the largest private residence in Manhattan, and he was facing living in a prison cell with rats and whatnot, and that he did not want to live anymore. So that he genuinely tried to kill himself. And now a story has emerged where he apparently told friends that he thought he was going to get off again. And he was optimistic. And he wanted to go through with the legal process. What is your take on that? And then Elizabeth, please finish this out. Thanks.
Well, I've seen reports, too, that he told people close to him that his first alleged suicide attempt was actually a murder attempt and that he was afraid that he may be killed. And those were the same people that also confirmed that he had been in good spirits at the time of his death. According to his lawyers, he before he died, he had planned to cooperate with the government. I think, both theories, that there's evidence to support both theories. What I think is really interesting, though, is that in mainstream media, there is still no consensus about what happened. Normally, when there's high-profile deaths, especially when they're under mysterious circumstances, there's a narrative that emerges with mainstream media quite quickly where they say, this is what happened, this is the official story, believe this. But what we're still seeing almost a week after he died is that there's people in the mainstream press that are reporting evidence that suggests he was murdered, and there's people reporting in the mainstream press that this was a suicide. As I point out, or as I said earlier, either way, I think that he was allowed to do this. I don't think this was some fluke in the prison system, considering who he was and that he had just been on suicide watch a few days before he died, and that his cellmate was taken out the day before he committed suicide. I think there's a lot of, strange things going on there. But what I think is really telling is that there is no official story in the mainstream media. So that either means no one knows what's going on, or that there's an effort to really just muddy the waters around this and just keep people guessing. So it's really hard to know in either case.
In the age of WikiLeaks going forward, it only takes one FBI agent raiding that the Little St. James. It only takes one person within the government to access this material and potentially leak it either to the public or to an organization like WikiLeaks. Do you think there's any possibility moving forward that there would be a significant leak of that would expose these types of networks to an extent that would go far beyond the kind of infinite connections that you're able to map, but where we really can't pin anything on these individual people who always seem to get away with these crimes? Do you think that there will ever be a leak like that? And as a kind of mirror of that question, do you think that there will ever be real serious prosecution of either the individuals running these rings or some sort of pushback against the agencies that in your article and series you explore their involvement in them?
Well, I think it's possible that this may be leaked out, but what I also think may have been going on, especially with the seizure of the electronics, especially if one studies the corruption of the FBI and their own involvement in these sort of rings, is that this may have just been a changing of hands of the blackmail that Jeffrey Epstein had, and that, within the U.S. government and also among international intelligence communities or in factions, the CIA or Israeli intelligence seem to have been involved here. There may be factional infighting, in which case if the FBI acquired all of this blackmail that is now in their hands, and they now have that leverage over the powerful people that Jeffrey Epstein had, if that had not been shared to a full extent with those same people. So what we may actually see, I'm really cynical, right? So I tend to think that, one corrupt guy with blackmail, now it's changed hands to another corrupt institution that is known for historically using blackmail. J. Edgar Hoover, the first FBI director, was famous for his use of blackmail against people like Martin Luther King Jr., among many other famous public figures. I really, as I mentioned, with Bill Barr being in charge of the Justice Department, I don't really see an honest investigation coming from the Justice Department. There is the option of a congressional investigation, but that depends on what percentage of people in the U.S. Congress have been blackmailed, whether it's by people that were connected to the Epstein ring or that have been blackmailed by other factions of the U.S. government. James Rothstein, that NYPD detective who received that admission from Roy Cohn that he was involved in this sort of stuff, said that he estimated that as many as 70% of the U.S. Congress is blackmailed at any given time by these sorts of activities. I think that's it's a very high number, frankly. And the fact this has been going on for decades, it's really unknown how many people it entrapped. It was known to have not just entrapped politicians, but prominent people in the military as well. So it's really hard to know exactly what's going to happen going forward. It depends on if the Epstein's blackmail, which was known to be stored on these electronic devices and hard drives and things like that, whose hands that's in now, what they'll end up using it for, if they'll actually, pursue the people involved. From what I've seen, not just Elaine Maxwell, but people like Leslie Wexner or another co-conspirator, Jean-Luc Brunel, who was acquiring girls for Epstein, some as young as 8 years old. He hasn't been questioned. There's been no effort to extradite him or arrest him. Not even, I think France was going to open their own Epstein probe that would assumably or presumably involve Jean-Luc Brunel to some extent. But the fact that we, the public, know who these co-conspirators were, and we know who the FBI should be chasing down. The FBI is not chasing them down. Anyone with a brain would think, oh, if you're investigating Epstein honestly, you would raid all of his residences as soon as he's arrested. It's been months now, and at least one of his residences, the one in New Mexico, hasn't been raided. Arguably the most notorious resident, the island, wasn't raided until after he died. And I just think it's really bizarre. I would really, of course, like to see some sort of big public leak of what was going on at that time. But given the U.S. government's war on whistleblowers and people like Bill Barr being in charge, and the example they're trying to set with people like Julian Assange, as I said, I tend to be cynical, so I don't expect such a leak unless people are really brave. That are involved in this, and I would like to put some hope back in people that are in the FBI or other places in government that could expose some of this. But it's also important to point out that it's really people in independent media that are bringing a lot of these angles out that the mainstream media is ignoring. So I think that's also important to point out as well, especially considering the mainstream media has been complicit in these sort of activities for decades, and that some of them are leading sort of this effort to distract from the bigger picture here. And I haven't really seen, many mainstream media articles that have been criticizing the investigation or like the delay in the FBI raid. I haven't seen a lot of that, and I think that's kind of telling. I really wish there would be more push from the mainstream media for that, because it's kind of obvious. But I think that's just going to have to come, I guess, from independent media. And I think also a lot of the outcome here is going to depend on public outrage. If people are angry enough, and if that outrage is sustained, then maybe we'll see something. But if the media or the government is successful in shifting the prevailing narrative from Epstein to some other scandal or mass shooting or what have you, some other event, then they'll probably feel that it's easier to cover this up and keep this quiet. So it's anyone that wants to see justice done here, it is imperative that you speak up and demand accountability, because if nothing changes here, and this is just another one of these operations that gets covered up by the federal government or gets ignored from the press and fades out of public view, these sorts of activities will continue well into the future. And I don't think, honestly, I think if Americans or really anyone is not outraged by the fact that the government and intelligence agencies have connections to pedophile rings and are protecting child rapists, I don't know what will make people angry enough to speak up if this doesn't.
Absolutely, well said. And I think that is, unfortunately, it's a sort of, it's a down note to end this conversation on. But I think it's very necessary to, if people don't realize how dire this is, that it's not going to change without them standing up and speaking out, then I think there's that potential for apathy, because it's an uncomfortable subject. Nobody wants to think about the government that they pay for with their tax funds being involved with or protecting these types of operations. But if we don't face that, then we're essentially turning our backs on the children that are used in these operations. So I think it's really important that you've done this incredible coverage of this ring and this network. And I thank you for coming on and speaking with us. It's been great to talk to you.
Great. Thanks so much for the opportunity.
And that wraps up this edition of CN Live, and we'll see you next week.
Get out your notebook. There's more.